They never surrendered to the power of Morpheus, nor did they accept changes until the final purification. Angie smiled and told her mother that she had finished cooking and they could go. The young lady was very happy, as for the first time in her life she was invited to the Duke's estate. Angie was very happy because she lived on Cullinan Island, where there were thick beech forests. On an island that was rebuilt by survivors of a devastating war on the mainland, turning it into a prosperous place. On the island, people of different races lived together peacefully. They were connected to each other like relatives. Guided by the faith of Kelum, they followed one goal without deviating from it. The young lady moved to the island with her parents when she was still a baby and did not remember anything about the mainland, but she didn't even feel the need for these memories. She loved the island very much, with all her heart. She knew that all this was possible thanks to the favor of the Duke and his family. She was surprised and could not imagine that she of all people was invited to keep Lord Kalek company, the only heir of the Blackwell family, the ruler of this island, an unfortunate young aristocrat who was locked within the walls of the estate and due to a long illness. The young lady's mother said that she would visit the lord once a week and keep him company. She said that his long illness had made him very picky and sensitive, so he could be hostile towards her. Her mother said that she had to understand him for their sake, since they all owed a debt to the Blackwell family. The young lady, in turn, very much hoped that the young master would like what she had prepared for him. Louisa Dunst met the young lady and greeted her. Angie greeted the head maid with a trembling voice. Louise glanced at her sideways and told her to move on. She looked closely at the young lady and said that the young master was already waiting for her. Angie followed the maid slowly, looking around the estate. The young lady, in turn, was very much struck by the beauty of the castle. It seemed to her that this place was from a completely different world. She stood frozen near the portraits, as she knew that the portrait of the young lord must hang there. The young lady was surprised, as there was no portrait yet. She wondered what he might look like. She thought that perhaps he had the same gray-blue eyes as the Duke. A moment later, she was taken aback as she heard the voice of the head maid. The maid looked at the young lady with a keen gaze and told her to hurry up. Angie ran hurriedly for the maid. Louise told her that there were a few things she should remember. Louise said that she would not see the gentleman's face, and if she felt that he was not behaving as he should or was not feeling well, she should call for help. Louise told her that she should only answer when asked and that she should refrain from making unnecessary comments. The young lady looked at Madame with surprise and intentness and said that she understood everything. Madame looked at the young lady with a keen gaze but did not answer. Angie looked at her with bewilderment. Louise knocked on the door and asked the gentleman if she could come in. Angie froze in surprise. The young lady in turn looked closely at the young gentleman's room. Louise said that she had brought a girl. Before Louise could finish speaking, the young master interrupted her. The young master asked angrily, hadn't he told her before? He said that he did not want to see visitors in his room. The young lady was shocked and wondered if he really did not want to see anyone. She heard rumors that the young master did not leave the rooms of the estate. The cause is the intensive chemotherapy he underwent during his long illness. Unfortunately, his face was disfigured. His terrifying appearance is capable of making people freeze as if they had encountered the Gorgon Medusa herself. The young lady wondered if this was why he didn't want her here. She was nervous, but not because of his face. Louise apologized for not asking his permission earlier. The young master sighed heavily and the young lady waited for an answer in a daze. He looked at the head maid and said that she could not disobey his father's orders. He sighed heavily and said that he would forgive her today, but next time he would not be so merciful. He looked at the head maid and told her to leave him. Louise Picorno agreed. Louise looked at the young lady and quietly told her to go and do what she came for. The young lady, in turn, stood frozen in a daze. She was a little scared she didn't know what to do and wondered if it was right for her to be here. She remembered her mother, who had said with a smile that she should do everything for them who were indebted to the Duke's family. She didn't know what to do if the young master suddenly drove her away. The young master looked at the young lady but didn't answer. A moment later, he called her. The young lady froze, not knowing what to do. A moment later, he told her to come to him. The lady was taken aback and said she would come right away. She thought he would get angry and throw her out. He looked at her intently and told her not to come too close and to sit by the window. A moment later, the young lady, having followed all the instructions of the young gentleman, sat down by the window. He asked her name. The lady said her name was Angela Risdell, but if he wanted, he could call her Angie. And she lives in a house on the North Shore. He asked her why she came to him. Angie said that she had the great honor of becoming his companion. She looked intently at the young master and said that she had come to him to tell him a story. The young gentleman looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what story she was talking about. She smiled and said it was just a figment of her imagination. Angie asked the young gentleman if he would like to hear a story. After she received the invitation from the Duke, she thought about her greatest passion: reading. Sewing and embroidery are the skills she is most confident in, but her lace would never impress the young aristocrat. She knew that he had already read many books while he was locked up, and she wanted to surprise him with something and interest him. Angie said with a smile that perhaps among the stories she could tell there would be some that he already knew. However, there are also stories that she herself came up with endings for. She said that if he listened to her and shared his thoughts, she would tell him about her own thoughts. She said that, of course, if he said that it was complete nonsense, she would not be convinced. The young master sighed heavily with a smile on his face. He said that if she were offended, it would not affect him in any way. Angie could not respond because she knew that he was right. He looked closely at the young lady and said that she could tell her story. The young lady in turn was very pleased. He said that if they turned out to be simply absurd, he would throw her out without hesitation. The young lady said she understood. She knew she just had to do what she always did since everyone in the church liked her stories. She asked him with a smile if he was familiar with the story of the Cumean Sibyl. She asked him for permission to tell him about the ancient Egyptian prophetess. As she spoke, her throat burned with thirst, and the look from her veil was unsettling, but the master allowed her to finish her story. The young lady in turn slowly returned home. The young gentleman looked at her intently and told her to come at the same time next week. He also wished her a safe journey and called her by name. The young lady was shocked because the young gentleman remembered her name. She was shocked because she understood that she had succeeded. At first she was very scared, but it seemed that he was not as difficult to please as she thought. She wondered, with a smile on her face, what she should tell him next time. The young master in turn stared at the young lady who was leaving the estate with a smile on her face. The young man sighed heavily, looking around. He was glad that he could finally escape from this island. His parents looked at him intently and asked if he didn't know what a precious blessing his life was. They said that the Duke had gathered all the survivors of that terrible war and allowed them to live in abundance on this island. They said that the mainland was nothing but a living hell. He knew that his parents did not understand anything since the days of life on the island were unbearable for him. He knew that the outside world was much bigger than this place. He wanted to go there and follow it. He had plenty of food and water, so he could go and find a better life. The young man was surprised as he could not think that he would escape from the island so easily. He couldn't believe that no one had even tried to do something like this before. A moment later, the young man froze, looking at the large windmill. He knew that it marked the boundary between the island and the outside world. He was surprised because it was larger than he thought. He knew that as soon as he swam past it, he would finally escape from the island, but suddenly something crashed into him. The young man fell into the boat. He was very surprised. He was shaking with fear because he did not understand what had happened at all. A moment later, a young man's cry was heard. He begged for mercy. The man screamed in the damp dungeon and asked for more blood. He was shaking, and he could not control himself. The young man looked intently at the young man who was in prison. The madam looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she had an incredible talent for embroidery. Everyone was surprised, as she was able to make very fine lace. The young lady in turn thanked them for their kind words, and Madame asked her what the names of the flowers she embroidered each time were. Angie said with a smile that they were marigolds, and she used them instead of her name. Everyone present was surprised, as they did not expect that she had such a beautiful signature. The young lady said that it was so, as these were her favorite flowers. She said with a smile that every time she sees them, her heart warms. She said that for this reason, she would one day like to make clothes inspired by these flowers. She said with a sweet smile that she would like to create clothes that will make someone smile sincerely. Madame looked at the young lady and said that she had no doubt that she would succeed. Letizia said with a smile that she would create the most incredible clothes on the island, and later she would become her personal seamstress. Letitia smiled and hugged her friend. telling her friend that she should sign the contract only with her. The adults were fascinated by the young ladies and were very pleased that they got along so well with each other. Letitia smiled and told her friend that since they were talking about it, they needed to sign the contract now. Angie heard adults talking in the distance about how small animal corpses had been found all over the forest. They were shocked because they didn't know who could have done such a thing. The young lady in turn froze in a daze. A moment later, everyone's eyes turned to the man running towards them. The man was breathing heavily. The woman looked at him intently and offered him water. He said there was no time for that. He looked at everyone intently and said that Elliot's body had washed up on the south coast. Everyone was shocked by what they heard. The woman looked at the children and told them to come home right now. She told them not to turn anywhere and to go straight home. Angie was shocked by this news. The adults said that Elliot was the only son in the family. They said that he tried to sail away from the island in a boat the night before. They said it must have been God's punishment that he had betrayed the Duke. The man said they should remind the children of this. The man said that they should never leave the island because the same thing could happen to them as happened to the young man. Adults said the young man had tried to leave the island the night before but was attacked by a shark and died. This incident shocked all the island's inhabitants. The young man's parents were inconsolable for several days in a row, and the young lady in turn had never seen anyone grieve so much before. Mrs. Hawkins greeted the young lady with a smile. The lady looked at the young lady intently and asked if she was going away somewhere. The lady smiled and said that the weather was wonderful today, like God's grace. She looked at the young lady and asked with a smile if she agreed with her. Angie smiled back. She was in shock because just yesterday the lady was grieving very much for her son, and now she was smiling brightly, as if someone had erased her memories. The young lady looked at her friend and said, puzzled, that for this reason the Mrs.'s behavior seemed a little strange to her. She said she had never experienced sadness before, so she was curious if the feeling could disappear so quickly. The young man said that there may be more to it than meets the eye. He asked her why she didn't have a cup of tea, as she seemed to be shocked by what she had seen, and tea would help her calm down. The young lady thanked him for his concern. He looked at her intently and said that since they were talking about it, he would like to tell her something. The young gentleman looked at her intently and said that he advised her to keep all her observations strictly between them. He said that she found Mrs.'s behavior strange, and others might decide the same. He said people might think she was suspicious because she was having thoughts like that. The young lady froze in place, but a moment later she said that she understood him and would be careful. She thanked him for his concern, but was still a little puzzled as she had not even considered such a possibility. She hoped he didn't find her comment offensive. She was surprised he listened to her until the end. He said that if she had any common sense, she would have done so even if he hadn't said so, and she thought sheepishly that she seemed to have jumped to conclusions. The young lady said that this tea had a wonderful aroma. It was a little different from the rose tea she usually drank. The young lady said with a smile that her mother and father would have liked it too. The Lord looked at her and said that if she liked it, she could take the tea leaves with her. He looked at her intently and said that he would certainly tell Louise about this. The young lady thanked him with a smile as she was very pleased with his care. He looked at her intently and said he wanted to talk about the story she told him last time. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she was listening. He said that she spoke of the Sibyl, the Cumaean priestess who desired immortality, and she received from Apollo as a gift 1,000 years of life. But as she watched her body wither over the course of these long years, she realized that this was not a blessing but a curse. The young lady was surprised that he remembered she looked at him intently and said that it was exactly like that. The Lord looked at her intently and asked what her answer would be. Angie looked at him in surprise. The Lord asked if Apollo would come to her and offer her immortality and eternal youth. She considered the matter for a moment, but a moment later she said that she would decline his offer. The Lord looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she would do such a thing. She said that probably at first you wanted to accept such a gift without question. She said that the beauty and meaning of life comes from its ephemerality. Even the most exquisite flowers fade when their lifespan comes to an end. Angie said that new shoots were growing in their place. She said she thought it could be called a presentiment. He looked at her intently and asked if she was saying that immortality meant nothing to her. The young lady looked at the young gentleman intently and said with a smile that it was exactly like that. She said that although she is sure that many would like to live forever, she looked at him intently and asked what he thought about it. The Lord thought for a moment. He was in shock and simply could not believe that there were people like her left on the island. He wanted to say something, but suddenly he heard a noise. The lady said that it must be time for their conversation. The young gentleman was very puzzled, as he did not want to let her go. The young lady smiled and said that she would be back next week. The young master in turn sighed heavily. He was puzzled as he had given in to emotions. The headmaid looked at the gentleman intently and asked what he thought. She asked the gentleman if the new medicine was suitable for him. With lightning speed, the Lord went out to the headmaid and angrily told her not to call her that. He looked at the maid with fury and said that his mood was spoiled by the mere mention of that word. The boy told his father that he wanted to know what medicine was. He asked if someone were chosen as his medicine, what would happen to him. The man said that when his blood chooses someone, there will be no turning back. The medicine will belong to him forever. The young man wondered with fury if this was the reason he killed his mother, if it was simply because she was his medicine. The medicine is the one who protects the owner by offering his blood until the person is skin to bone. It all started with a terrible curse, a curse born of something that people should never dare to desire. The young ladies were discussing the Duke having other heirs. The lady said she had heard the adults talking about it. Several years ago, the Duchess gave birth to many children, even twins, but they died shortly after birth. The lady looked closely at her friends and asked if they had heard of the Lord's face. Letitia asked her friend if she was talking about the medicine he was taking that had disfigured his face. She said that was exactly it, and she heard that he usually hides his face. She said he was becoming like a creepy monster. The young ladies were shocked by what they heard. The lady said that people were very worried because the Duke was not feeling well at the moment. She said that his only heir was locked in the estate, and they say that the Lord has a bad temper, so he beats the servants every day. Angie asked her friends if they were jumping to conclusions. She said that the Lord was not like that at all, as he was quite sensitive and perceptive. The lady looked at her in surprise and asked how she knew. She asked if Angie had seen him in person. The young lady was taken aback, as she knew that her mother had told her to keep it a secret. She timidly said that it was wrong to support such gossip. She said that the Duke's virtue had given them the opportunity to live in abundance on the island. The young lady was taken aback and said that it was all true. Letitia said that they had no right to judge the young master's character. Letitia pressed herself closer to her friend and said that his face was certainly repulsive. Angie didn't know what he looked like. All she knew was that he was tall and had a deep voice. She knew that, despite his inherent coldness, he was considerate of others, and until now Angie had not thought about his face. At first she was afraid of him only because she expected to be thrown out, but strangely she could not get Letitia's words out of her head. Angie was told that the Lord was busy in his office, so she might not be able to see him today. She had been waiting for him for 20 minutes already, and she was feeling a little sleepy. She slowly walked to the window and looked out. Angie realized what the Lord saw every day from the window. She knew the view from the window was very beautiful, but she felt sorry that he could only watch everything from afar. She didn't know, unfortunately, how seriously ill he was, but she knew that it would be wonderful if they could take a walk together. The Lord returned to his room and saw that the young lady was sleeping quietly. He slowly wrapped her in a blanket. The young gentleman looked at the young lady intently, not taking his gaze away from her. Jerome looked at the gentleman closely and said that it seemed that rumors from the church had spread among the children. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed like the young lady thought he was some kind of disgusting monster. Jerome looked at the gentleman intently and said that it was not that. The young gentleman looked at the manager in bewilderment. Jerome said that the young lady actually protected him, and she was the only one who did it. The Lord was shocked. He didn't expect to hear something like that. Jerome told the gentleman that if the rumors were causing him inconvenience, he would take care of them. The young gentleman said there was no need for that. He looked closely at the young lady and wondered how it was that her opinion was different from the others. He said it made him want to expect more. The young gentleman looked at the young lady intently and said that he really wanted her to wish for him sincerely. The young lady in turn heard some noise and woke up, but the young gentleman covered her eyes with his palm. The young lady was perplexed, but the Lord asked her not to open her eyes. She was confused and didn't know what was going on at all. She wondered if it was really a lord in front of her now. Angie could smell the rich scent of roses coming from the young gentleman. He said that she had better go home today, as he had some things to do that required his attention. Angie agreed with him. Lord said that from now on he would like her to visit him 3 times a week. He would like to hear her stories. Angie was very happy. She asked, with a smile, if she could really visit him so often. The young master was surprised. He didn't expect such a reaction. But a moment later she said with a smile that it was so, and he would wait for her. He moved closer to her, and with a charming smile said that he would look forward to her arrival. The young lady lived on an estate on the north coast, looked after by her parents. She often helped with the housework and sometimes came to the coast to get some fresh air. The cottage was located next to the northern cliff, which meant that in the summer it was pleasantly cool. The young lady saw that the roses had already blossomed, and Angie was amazed by their beauty. She knew that the harvest would soon begin. Angie couldn't take her eyes off the beautiful flowers. At this time of year, the Duke's family would create a powder from Bengal roses, which the islanders would mix with water before drinking. The young lady was struck by the divine aroma. The roses did not have a very strong scent, but on the contrary, a subtle and persistent one. Suddenly, she was flooded with memories of the Lord saying he wanted her to feel sorry for him. The young lady in turn was filled with embarrassment. She still could not believe it. The young lady wondered what had prompted him to say such a thing, and to her of all people. The more time she spent at the Duke's estate, the more she wanted to know what kind of man the Lord was. Louise told Angie that the gentleman had ordered the cookies to be given to her because she had liked them so much earlier, and Angie was surprised to thank him for the gift. Angie asked the Lord with a smile what food he liked the most, if he had any favorite desserts. He asked the young lady in surprise what kind of stupid questions she was asking. He told her that she should just tell the story. At times it seemed to her that he drew a line between them, but still she obeyed and told interesting stories. The Lord listened to her with a smile. The young gentleman said with a smile that it was very funny that people turned every tragedy into a comedy. The young lady was shocked because she realized that she had made him laugh. But every now and then she noticed moments when he let his guard down, and she wondered what expression he had on his face when he looked at her. Angie would like to see the man behind the veil one day. A moment later she heard some noise and turned around but saw nothing. She was puzzled because she had heard that animals were dying mysteriously in the forest. The lady asked her daughter if she had already hung out the laundry. Angie said with a smile that she had done everything and ran hurriedly to her mother. The young lord stood quietly behind the tree and watched the young lady. The young lady thanked the man with a smile for giving her a ride. She said with a smile that the weather was wonderful today, so she would walk the rest of the way. The man said it was an excellent idea. He said she could take a walk in the garden. Angie said she would definitely do that. Angie looked at the flowers. She was curious what the Lord would say about the flowers. She couldn't wait to give them to him. It seemed to her that many years had passed since she had first chosen to follow this path. She knew that time would go on as usual, leaving behind countless traces. Louise greeted Angie. The young lady greeted the headmaid with a smile. Before she knew how quickly time was flying, she was already 18 years old. 3 years had passed during this time, which seemed to her both long and fleeting. A lot had happened. Her relationship with the young lord has undergone many changes. The young lady was slowly telling a new story when suddenly the Lord told her to call him by name. She was surprised, looked at him, and asked what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and told her to eat. The moment his kai collapsed, the young lady was shocked. But at the same time she thanked him with a smile and said that from now on she would call him by his name. Looking out the window, she said that it was already late before freedom. The Lord said that dinner had already been prepared, so she needed to eat before leaving. He looked at her intently and said that if she wanted, then maybe there was an estate for you. The young lady was surprised. She said with a smile that she really enjoyed his selection of fine teas, as she usually only drank pink. The young master said that he only wanted to give her a reason to visit this place. She knew that her connection with the young lord was growing stronger every day. Angie found herself wanting to catch a glimpse of him. Unlike Psyche, who used a candle to illuminate the god's face, she lacked the courage or recklessness to even glance at him. The Lord looked at her closely and said that it seemed she had caught a cold again. He knew that this happened to her constantly during the winter. she said with a smile that this time it wasn't so bad and she only had a slight cough. He said that she had said the same thing last year, and he didn't like it. The young lady was puzzled, but didn't answer. The Lord asked her if there was anything she wanted. She looked at him in confusion and asked what he was talking about. The Lord said that her birthday was coming soon, and he would like to give her a present. She was a little puzzled as she knew that he usually just surprised her without even asking. He looked at her and said with a smirk on his face that she was turning 18. He said he wanted to give her something to celebrate her coming of age. He looked intently at the young lady who stood frozen in shock. Sometimes it seemed to her that he could read her thoughts as if he were looking straight into her eyes. For a moment she thought about what she wanted. She thought that she wanted him to fulfill one of her wishes. He looked at her and called out. She was about to say what she wanted, but suddenly she heard the Lord cough. Angie rushed towards the young master with lightning speed. She called him, but everything was clear. She ran closer to him because she was very worried about him. The young lord coughed even more but still managed to tell her not to come near him. The young lady froze in shock and didn't know what to do. In a hurry, the young gentleman told her to just stay where she was. A moment later, a servant ran into the room, Louise shouting at them to hurry. Louise ran up to the young lady. Angie was puzzled and didn't know what to do as this had never happened before. People in the temple prayed. They believed that with the help of prayer they would be saved and live better. The young lady prayed because she wanted the young master's body and mind to find peace. She wondered if the young lord was feeling any better. She knew that her cold was nothing compared to the pain he was experiencing. This had happened many times before, but it seemed that his condition was especially severe that day. She hoped that her prayer would reach heaven and help him. The young lady was slowly returning home from the temple, but suddenly she heard something. She looked into the distance and saw a suspicious man and woman. She was puzzled because she didn't know who it could be. She thought that it seemed like they were discussing something extremely important. She knew that they should be worried about it. The madam looked at her daughter and said that she had received a letter from the Duke's house. The young lady was surprised. She saw that the letter was from the Lord. He wrote that he would very much like to talk to her personally, but could not do so due to health reasons. He wrote that he would have to focus on treatment. He wanted to know what she wanted for the holiday, and he also wanted to see her after recovery. The young maid told the gentleman that he needed an immediate blood transfusion for the medicine. The Lord said angrily and puzzledly that he was not going to do that. The maid would have liked to object, but the Lord insisted on his own. He looked at her hard and told her not to make him repeat himself twice. He said he would never hurt her. The Lord sat and read a letter from the young lady. She wrote that she felt relieved after reading his letter. She wrote that she sincerely hoped that his treatment would go smoothly no matter how long it took. She said that she did not need anything as a gift. Angie said she had one wish he could grant, but she didn't know if he would want to do it. She wrote that she would really like to see his face. The Lord was puzzled, as she had no idea what thoughts were going through his mind every time he saw her. When a genuine smile appears on her face, which was not present in other drugs, when she expresses her opinion without thinking about what others think, and when she refused the eternal life that others so coveted, and instead she accepted the value of mortal life, he caught himself thinking that he was enchanted by her as if he had been struck by some mystical force. He was captivated by her pale, refined hands, luxurious hair, sparkling eyes. He was especially attracted by her beautiful cheeks, which turned pink when she was shy. He knew she had no idea how hard he was trying to control himself. Every time he saw her lovely lips, he restrained his desire. He wondered if she would stay by his side when his secrets were revealed. The madam told her daughter with a smile that since she couldn't beat her cold, she should at least eat her favorite dishes. The young lady thanked her mother for the wonderful dinner. She enjoyed the delicious dishes. Madam Puzzled said that she hated to watch her suffer every winter. Father said that as soon as she got better, she should drink rose tea. The madam said that it really did work wonders, and that was why everyone on the island drank it. The young lady said that she would certainly drink it. Madam told her daughter that she had heard that she had been teaching the children at church to sing, and Angie said with a smile that they were doing well. The young lady said that she was still deciding which songs to teach the children. She said she could teach them songs about the sea or the night. A moment later she sang another song and froze in place. She looked at her mother and asked if she had ever taught her such a song. The lady looked at her husband in confusion and said that she had never heard of it and asked him. He said that he had not heard of this composition either. The lady asked her daughter if she was sure they were singing it. The young lady sighed heavily and said she wasn't sure the song just popped into her head. The lady looked at her daughter and said with a smile that it was time for them to get ready for bed. Madam told her daughter that tomorrow was her birthday, so she would prepare something special. Lady said that she couldn't wait to see it. The young lady in turn was slowly getting ready for bed. Lying in bed, she recalled this melody. She was puzzled because she did not remember anyone humming it to her. The young lady quickly fell asleep to the beautiful song. She fell asleep, and suddenly a beautiful landscape appeared before her. A moment later, she heard someone say hello to her. The man looked at her intently and asked if she could hear him. The young lady in turn was puzzled and did not understand who it could be. The man shouted at her and asked her to say something in response. He looked at her and asked if she was familiar with the song. The young lady froze in shock. The man ran towards her and shouted that if she knew, he would like to get an answer. He ran up to her and shouted his name. The young lady looked at him with fear. Waking up, the young lady wondered what kind of dream it was. She realized that it was too bright and strange for an ordinary dream. For a moment, she thought about the young man she had seen, for he seemed very real to her. A moment later, Madame knocked on the door and asked her daughter if she was awake. Angie said hastily that she was already up. Going downstairs, Angie saw many gifts from the young lord. She slowly took one gift, curious about what was in the box. She also saw a letter that was addressed to her. The young lord congratulated the young lady on her coming of age. He said that he was very sorry that he could not congratulate her personally. He wrote that he was trying his best to get well, so he asked her to wait for him for another 10 days, and then he would give her a real gift. The young lady slowly opened the gift that the Lord had sent her. She looked at the ball in surprise. She was very happy with all his gifts, but wondered if by a real gift he meant that he would show his face. The lady looked at her daughter and said with a smile that she had wonderful gifts. The lady asked her daughter if this was the first time the Lord had sent her a gift for her birthday. She said that it seemed the Lord had opened up to her. The lady said that was exactly it. She was embarrassed about the gifts she had received on previous birthdays, and that was why she had not told anyone. The lady told her daughter that they were born one day apart. Angie looked at her mother in surprise. A moment later, she asked her mother if she was sure about it. She said she didn't even know his birthday was right after hers. Madam said that if she remembered correctly, it was his birthday tomorrow. The young lady thought for a moment, because no matter how much she asked, her mother had never told her this. She could not believe that she did not know about it. Madam told her daughter that it did not matter much, as the Duke and Lord preferred to spend their birthdays quietly. The young lady looked at her mother in surprise and asked why this was so. Madame said that it was simply an unspoken rule since they were against any celebrations. She looked at her mother and asked what exactly the Lord was ill with. She said that her heart ached for the Lord as he could not enjoy even simple joys. Angie is very worried about him as she can't do anything about it. Madame said that she should never say this in front of strangers. Madame said that the Duke's family was very different from theirs, and they carried a heavy burden on their shoulders, and they in turn were obliged to respect their wishes. Madame asked her daughter why she didn't pray for the Lord today if it really bothered her. She wrote a letter to the Lord that she had a wonderful birthday and it was filled with heartfelt wishes from people. She wrote that she received many gifts, but the best of them was the snow globe he sent her. She thanked him for giving her eternal winter. The young lady also wrote that she missed him very much. She hoped that once his treatment was completed, she would be able to see him in full health. She wanted to finally see his beautiful smile on his face. She wondered if she could make such a wish. The young lady in turn prayed for the Lord and asked him to grant him a peaceful life and good health. She knew she had to wait another 4 days until the Lord's treatment was complete. The young lady was slowly leaving the temple when she suddenly heard someone talking. She was a little puzzled because she heard someone talking about blood transfusion and medicine. She was puzzled and did not understand what they were talking about. She walked slowly back home, wondering if those people were gone. A moment later, she heard some noise and froze in fear. Turning around, she saw a man, and it seemed to her that she had seen him somewhere before. The young lady froze in place in shock as she saw the young man walking straight towards her. The man walked up to her and greeted her with a smile, and Angie stood there in confusion. He said with a smile that he thought they had met before. He asked if she remembered him. She asked in bewilderment what he was talking about. The young man said that perhaps she had not seen him. She looked away from him and timidly said what she saw. He smiled and said that he was here now to help his aunt, as she was the caretaker of the church. The young lady realized that the woman she had seen with the young man was named Hester. The young lady froze in place as she realized what had happened. One day, Mother told her that her elder sister Hester had died of illness many years ago. The child she raised alone was born with a weak body and was barely able to leave the house. She remembered her mother telling her that the boy had albinism. She wondered if that was why he had purple eyes. She looked closely at the young man as it reminded her of the situation with the Lord. He looked at her and asked if she still didn't believe him. The young lady was taken aback as she was too deep in her thoughts. He said with a smile that if she would allow it, he would like to walk her home since it was already late and the night was dark. The young lady said that everything was fine and that she always took this route home. She said goodbye to the young man and ran away in a hurry. He stared after her because he was very sorry that she did not agree. He realized that he did not even have a chance to tell her his name. With the speed of lightning, the young lady fell asleep. She was puzzled because she found herself in the same dream again. A moment later, turning around, she saw a man running towards her and asking if she could hear him. Angie was confused as he was in her dream again. Angie was in shock as she couldn't speak, but a moment later she was engulfed in flames, the man shouting at her to be careful. She was in shock and did not understand where the fire came from in her. The man ran to her and shouted that they would meet again. He asked her not to forget about him. He shouted that his name was Martin Silva. The young lady woke up in agony. She was in shock as she did not expect such a thing. A moment later, she heard some scream outside the window. She was puzzled as it was similar to the one she heard in her dream. The young lady decided to check what it was. She went out into the street late at night. She knew she had to check everything herself. The young lady walked slowly towards where the sound was coming from, but a moment later something rushed past her, and she froze in place. She wondered if it was a wild animal. A few minutes later, she collapsed to the ground and saw in front of her terrible predatory eyes that were staring at her. She was very scared because she realized that they were looking straight at her. Out of fear, she dropped her lamp, but a moment later she found it. She was trembling with fear because she realized that this huge shadow was moving straight towards her. A moment later, she saw a young man in front of her covered in blood. She froze in place as she was too afraid to utter a word. A moment later, she heard a scream and fell to the ground with lightning speed. The young man in turn managed to catch her. He looked at her intently and asked how he could now present her with his gift. Kai sighed heavily and said that it seemed like his father had finally quenched his thirst. He looked closely at the young lady and said that he didn't know how she ended up here, but this was a very dangerous place for her. The whole forest and also the island was dangerous for her. He looked at the young lady intently and asked her to hold on for a little while until he had enough strength to protect her. He swore that he would destroy this curse with his own hands. The madam was slowly cleaning the room. The young lady looked at her mother in surprise and called her. The madam looked at her daughter with a smile and said that she was just about to wake her up. The young lady said timidly that she was curious about something. She looked at her mother intently and asked how she got home last night. Madame looked at her daughter in surprise and frowning in confusion asked what she meant. Angie asked her mother if she knew that she had left last night. The lady looked at her daughter in surprise and said that she did not understand what she was talking about. The madam looked at her daughter intently and said that she and her father had not heard anything last night. The young lady froze in shock as she looked at her mother. Madam said that she meant that strange cry she spoke of. Madam told her daughter to think a little, because if she really went into the forest, her shoes would be dirty, but she was perfectly clean. She said that the front door was locked, and when she went to see her at dawn, she was as usual sleeping soundly in her bed. Madame said with a smile on her daughter's face that it seemed she was just having a nightmare. She told her daughter to throw such silly thoughts out of her head and get down to breakfast. Angie sighed heavily and said that this couldn't be true. She was puzzled by the whole situation. She wondered how all this could be just a dream. She knew that yesterday she had seen a terrible picture with her own eyes. She knew that there was someone in the forest. He was so beautiful that it was hard to even believe that he was there. She was puzzled because she clearly remembered what she had actually dreamed. In her dream, there was a man standing on a green meadow and shouting his name. She quietly whispered his name. The madam looked at her daughter in surprise and asked what she had said. The young lady timidly said that she had said nothing. She knew that if she told her mother about her dream, she would think something even stranger about her. She intended to check everything herself later. She wanted to find out if Martin Silva really existed. Madame looked at her daughter and asked, since her cough had not become so strong, why didn't she drink rose tea today? Angie said that she would prefer tea with honey. She said that she thought it would be better to drink it when she was fully recovered. Madame looked closely at her daughter and agreed with a smile. She told her daughter that she had heard about the Lord's condition, which was gradually improving. The young lady looked at her mother in surprise and asked if it was true. Madame smiled and said that it seemed that the development of the new drug was nearing completion. Angie said with a smile on her face that it was very good, and she felt relieved. She knew that it seemed like her prayers had reached heaven. The young lady, in turn, only wanted to be able to talk to him again as soon as possible. She knew that even if it meant that she would only hear his voice again, she wanted it. The young lady rode leisurely in a carriage on a cloudy day. The man told the young lady's parents that it was spring cleaning time, and they usually cleaned the estate thoroughly at this time of year, but several of the maids had fallen ill with the flu, so they urgently needed to find new people. The young lady looked closely at the man and saw that he was holding a piece of paper in his hand. She slowly took it and unfolded it to read the contents. The man told her parents that he assured them that the young lady would be home tomorrow. Her father was a little worried, but he knew it was for the best. He knew his daughter had a slight cold. She saw a letter from the young lord who wrote that he would like to give her a real birthday present today. He wrote that Zachary asked her for help with his son's spring cleaning, and they could meet in the garden that evening. The young lady beamed with happiness after the note. Zachary looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if she could go. With lightning speed, she hid the note and said with a smile that she would be happy to help him with the cleaning. The young lady was puzzled as it seemed to her that the number of lies continued to grow like a snowball, but she understood perfectly well that this was the only way for her to see him. Sometime later, the young lady found herself in the conservatory known as, it was said to have been lovingly built by the Duke for his lady. She knew that today, in the very center of the sanctuary, she would meet the young lord. The young lady in turn froze in place. She could not believe what she saw. She wondered if it was him. The Lord turned around and looked at the young lady with a smile on his face. She was shocked as she realized that she had seen him in the forest. The Lord came closer to her with a smile and greeted her. The young lady froze in place, for she knew that voice. She looked closely at the young man and asked if it was Kai. He smiled and said that it was true, and it was him. She was shocked and did not understand how this could happen. She looked at him intently and asked if this meant that the man she came across in the forest was him. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that it was true. Kai came closer to her and hugged her. He said that she probably passed out from shock, so he carried her home. Kai said with a smile that it seemed like she remembered everything. The young lady looked at the young man, confused and puzzled, said that her mother told her that it was all a dream, and she said that there were no signs of her going outside. He looked at her closely and said that he had replaced all signs of her running away because he did not want her parents to worry about her. The Lord looked at the young lady intently and said that he had erased the marks of her boots in the snow and hung up her cloak. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing in the woods. Angie said that she had gone there because she had heard a strange noise. She asked if that was why he had been there too. He looked at her intently, but a moment later said that he too had been awakened by a strange cry. He said that it turned out that there was something wrong with the windmills, and the sound was coming from them, and he learned about it from Jerome. But later the Lord looked closely at the young lady and said that it was very strange that no one went to check except her. The young lady in turn thought for a moment and wondered if the sound could really come from the windmills. She knew that the cry definitely belonged to a living person. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she liked the gift. The young lady froze in place. She did not know what to answer, as she had tried to imagine him many times. She had no choice but to listen to the words of other people, but even in her wildest dreams she could not imagine such a striking face. He looked at her with a keen gaze and said with a smile that he didn't mind. If she came closer to him, Angie froze in place. She didn't know what to do in this situation. Lore said that she could push him away at any moment if she felt uncomfortable, while he gently took her hand. He smiled and said that he would always respect her wishes. She looked at him intently and wondered how she could not desire him. The Lord touched her lips tenderly, and a moment later, he kissed her tenderly. Angie was in shock and thought that her heart could jump out of her chest right now. She felt his sweet breath. She was in shock as she felt herself being overwhelmed by a wave of ecstasy. She just couldn't tear herself away from him. The young lady looked at the young man with confusion and intentness. She was puzzled as her mind was in a fog. She understood that this was definitely not a dream. But looking at the Lord, she couldn't believe that it was real. She couldn't believe that she was kissing him now. She knew he was the only heir to the Duke's family, and she found it hard to believe that he was spending time with her. The Lord looked at her with surprise and intentness and asked with puzzlement if everything was all right with her. She pushed him away and said that something was wrong with her. The young man was taken aback with this statement. He stepped away from her for a moment and, in a friendly voice, asked if he had really done something that she didn't want. Angie looked at him intently and said that it was not like that at all. She looked at him timidly and said with embarrassment that she wanted that too. A moment later, she looked at him sadly and timidly said that they were from completely different worlds. Kai froze in shock. He couldn't say a word. He didn't expect to hear something like that at all, but a moment later he said that if she was worried about it, then there was no need. He looked at her intently and said that she should know this better than anyone. He looked intently at the young lady and said that only she was precious to him. The young lord tenderly raised her hand to his face and kissed it tenderly. The man spoke furiously that the boy was more precious to him than anyone else, and he really wanted his boy to live out the rest of his days in good health and completely unharmed. Jerome sighed heavily but said nothing. The man looked at Jerome intently and said that this was his last wish. He told Jerome that he could use any means, be it new drugs or witchcraft. He told Jerome that he could even use the medicine. He looked at Jerome intently and said that he had to save Kyle. He shouted furiously at his friend that he had to do something at any cost. He looked at her closely and said that she should know that she was more important to him than anything else in the world. He said that if she didn't feel the same way as he did, then that was a different matter. The young lord slowly began to let go of the young lady, but she grabbed his hand. She looked down and said that it was not like that. She felt the same as he did. She said that she had been waiting for this moment for a long time and prayed every night. The young lady looked at him with a smile and said that she had imagined the moment when they would stand and face each other. She looked at him with a soft smile and said that she hoped that the day would come when she could finally talk to him while looking him in the eye. But a moment later, she said sadly that she had humble origins. She looked closely at the young lord and said that they were sure that they should become even closer to each other. He looked closely at the young lady and timidly said that his late mother was the daughter of his father's piano teacher. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She was a little puzzled, as she had not known this, and had previously assumed that his mother was of a family equal in rank to the Duke's house. The young lord looked at the young lady intently as he knelt down and said that he was trying to tell her that the fact that he was a Blackwell would not be a barrier to their relationship. He looked at her intently and said that he just wanted to hear the answer that came from her heart. The young lady froze in place as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She realized in turn that she could not forget what her heart desired since she felt it beating uncontrollably. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she felt the same way about him. She wanted to be brave, just this once. The young man stood there, embarrassed, shocked, and not expecting to hear something like that. But a moment later, he tenderly embraced the young lady and quietly whispered her name. The young man saw them from afar and shouted that this couldn't be. He woke up and was breathing heavily. The young man was puzzled because he saw her again. He saw a girl with blonde hair who had been appearing in his dreams lately. And now he saw a man next to her. He recognized his name because he himself had named it. The young man was a little puzzled as the heir of the Blackwell family was next to the girl he had dreamed of. He thought it was all very strange. The girl he had never seen before kept appearing in his dreams. He read the current newspaper about the imperial family, recognizing Kylum as an official religion. He was puzzled that all the events were happening on the island. He didn't know what he should do now. He couldn't even be sure that everything he saw in his dreams was actually real. He was puzzled because everything that was happening was driving him crazy. The young man wondered if this could all be a simple coincidence. He wondered if this was his destiny, one he shouldn't ignore. The young lady in turn sat quietly in the library and recalled the previous evening. The young lord looked at the young lady intently and said that he was very sorry to bring up this topic, but unfortunately his treatment would still take some time. The development of new drugs was still a trial and error process. The young lady froze in surprise. She didn't know what to say to him. He looked at her intently and said that for this reason, they probably wouldn't be able to see each other for now. Kai looked at the young lady intently and asked if she would be okay during this time. The young lady looked at her companion with a smile and said that of course she would be all right. She said she just wanted him to get better. A moment later, the young lady said out loud that she only wanted him to get better. She was taken aback and looked around hoping that no one had heard what she said. She knew that the Lord had told her that his treatment wouldn't last that long. This time, she knew that until then, she just had to be patient. Angie knew that there was no need to worry about it now. She knew that in any case it was indeed a mystery. The young lady in turn sat and looked for the name Martin Silva. She was a little worried as she did not see his name in the birthday register, but she in turn did not think that he was just a figment of her imagination. Until now, she had never had the feeling that her dreams were connected, so she thought it was one of the island's inhabitants. She knew she had to dig as deep as she could, as his name might be on the island's registry. The young lady slowly approached the man as she wanted to talk to him and find information. She asked for forgiveness in a puzzled tone and asked if his name was not on the register. She asked if there was no similar name. The man looked at the young lady intently and said that, as he had said earlier, there was no one with even a remotely similar name. He said she could look for herself as the book had, and me, all who had ever lived on the island for the last 20 years. But a man with such a man among them, no. The young lady knew the man was right, but she wondered what it could mean. She wondered if someone she had never seen could appear in her dreams. Angie was puzzled as she didn't even know if the man existed or not. She wondered if he was just some kind of ghost. The young lady looked at the man intently and said that she was curious about something. The man looked at her with bewilderment. She asked if there were any who had ended badly trying to escape the island. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady said she meant people like Elliot. He tried to sail a boat through the windmills. The man frowned and thought for a moment, but a moment later he said that as far as he knew, there had been no such cases. He looked at her intently and said with a smile on his face that she could look in the death register if she wanted. She knew that would be wonderful. A moment later she heard someone calling her and turned towards the noise. Letizia greeted everyone present with a smile. Letitia came closer to her friend and said with a smile that it was time for them to go, as they were already supposed to get together to weave the group lace. She looked at her friend and asked if she remembered about it. The young lady said with a smile that she forgot for a moment. Sometime later, they were leaving the library. Angie knew that she should look at the death registry later, as she might be able to see him again in her dreams and get more clues. The young lady frowned for a moment as she looked at her friend. She said that something had changed in her. Letitia looked at the young lady intently. Angie looked at her in confusion and asked what she meant. Letitia moved even closer to the young lady and said that she could swear that Angie had changed a lot. Angie was a little puzzled by her words. Letitia looked at her friend and said that she looked more beautiful than ever. The young lady froze in place in bewilderment. Letitia, running in circles around her friend with a smile and bewilderment, asked why she was so beautiful today. She wanted to know what her secret was. Letitia asked her friend if she had started dating someone and hadn't told her a word about it. Angie was shocked and said that, of course, she wasn't dating anyone. But a moment later she became embarrassed as she remembered the previous evening. She remembered the absurd offer the Lord had made her. Angie blushed. Letitia looked at her with a smile and said that she was very blushing and looked simply charming. A moment later, the young ladies looked into the distance as someone called them. Their friends slowly approached them and greeted them with a smile. They said that they could all go to the sewing room together. The young lady was taken aback for a moment and stood still. She looked at them in bewilderment and asked if there shouldn't be another person with them. The young ladies looked at her intently and asked her in confusion what she meant. Angie looked at them intently and said that she was quite sure there was another member in their embroidery circle. Angie said she remembered a tall girl with red hair and she always talked a lot. The young lady looked at her friend and asked with a smile if they really had one. The other girl said that she was sure that Angie had gotten something mixed up and that she had just imagined it. She said that it seemed like she had confused her with one of the characters from her book. Angie looked at her friends in bewilderment and said that she was absolutely sure that the girl had been making lace with them. She was puzzled by the fact that no one remembered her except her. The young lady looked at her with a keen gaze and said with a smile that she had previously said that she had heard some strange sound a few months ago. She said that this time she would not be taken in by it. Madame stood quietly in the distance and watched the young ladies closely. A moment later, Madame approached the girls and greeted them. Madame looked at them intently and asked if they were really making lace. She asked if everyone was there. One of the ladies looked at the madam intently and said that everything was in place. Angie looked at her friend in bewilderment as this was a lie. The madam looked at the young ladies and said that this was very good, but still they should go home now. The young lady looked at the madam in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. She asked if something was wrong. Madam. She wanted to say something, but she didn't have time. A moment later, they saw that young men in capes were heading to the temple. The young ladies froze in place with bewilderment on their faces. Madame looked intently at the temple and looking sideways at the young ladies said that the Duke had died that morning. The young gentleman slowly descended into the dungeon. He knelt down in front of his father and sighed heavily, saying that it was very strange that his father had finally closed his eyes. He said he felt like his father had never really been alive. He looked at his father, puzzled, and said that this must be how his late mother had seemed to his father. He knew that she had been his cure, his one original sin, and the only one he had ever loved. He said that he was simply amazed at the thought. He knew that after his mother's death, his father had given in to his madness and had begun to accept any blood transfusion that was available, and had eventually met a tragic end. The young lord in turn wondered what his destiny would be then. He didn't know if he could break this curse and get his own life back. The young lady in turn was very puzzled and simply could not believe that the Duke had left them. She had previously heard that his condition had worsened, but she did not expect that he would pass away so suddenly. She wanted to know if Kai was okay. She was very worried that he might be trying to deal with his overwhelming grief on his own. A moment later, she put her thoughts aside, however, as her mother asked if she could come in. The young lady looked at her mother in surprise and asked where her father was. Madame looked at her daughter and said that her father had just left to help with the funeral preparations. The madam looked at her daughter and said that in fact she was told that they would need her help too. The young lady looked at her mother in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Madam said that it would take a few days for everything to return to normal, but in the meantime, they wanted her to help them with the housework. Like last time, the young lady smiled and said that she would be very glad. She raised that she would be able to see the young lord. She in turn wondered if this was his way of calling her again. Madame looked closely at her daughter and said with a smile that she did not need to worry about anything, even though the Duke was no longer with them. Blackwell House as they always had. The young lady looked at her mother intently, but said nothing. Madame looked at her daughter and asked if she understood this. Angie sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. But a moment later, she looked at her mother closely and asked if everything would really be okay. She said that the young lord was currently undergoing treatment, but they didn't know if he would ever be cured. The madam looked at her daughter closely and said that if his condition did not improve, he might have to seek help outside the island. The young lady was surprised by what she heard. She was shocked because she didn't expect to hear something like that. She looked at her mother in confusion and said that they were not allowed to leave the island. She said that the waters around the island were full of sharks, and there were still traces of poisonous ones on the mainland. Madame looked at her daughter closely and said that she was right, but she should listen carefully to what she was about to tell her. Madame said that although she did not know the details, 2 or 3 times a year, a school of sharks migrates and the full moon deviates from its usual course and turns red, and then the opportunity arises to cross the sea in a boat. She said that knowing this, the deceased Duke sailed to the mainland in search of a cure 8 years ago. But unfortunately, he lost his servants during a storm, and not even a week passed before he was forced to return back, and for this reason he never told anyone about the crossing. She said that if he did, people might make dangerous attempts to leave the island, and without knowing the lunar cycle, they might die like Elliot. The young lady sighed heavily and asked if this meant that the curse was a safe place. She looked at her mother and asked if this was any different from what she had been forced to believe. Madame looked at her daughter and said that it was not so, since the Duke was in despair and had therefore left to get medicine. Getting out of bed, Madame spoke about her daughter so that she would not fill her head with stupid thoughts. The madam looked at her daughter intently and told her not to tell anyone what they had just talked about. She looked at her daughter and asked if she understood her. The young lady, in turn, froze in place. A moment later, she walked up to her mother and, taking her hand, said that she had one more question. She asked her mother when the next lunar cycle would be. Madame looked at her daughter in surprise and said that she did not know this, and probably only the servants who had been serving in the Duke's house for a long time were aware of this. Madame looked at her daughter and said that it was time for her to pack her things, as she needed to go to the Duke's house immediately after the funeral. The young lady stood frozen in place after her mother left. She thought that this situation was very strange. It never occurred to her that she had a chance to leave this island. Sometime later, they held a funeral ceremony. The young lady stood with her mother and saw the Duke off. The lady looked at her daughter and told her to stand still and she would come right away. Angie knew that Kai most likely wouldn't come, since after all he had never shown himself in front of others before. But a moment later, she saw a young man in front of her. She was surprised and wondered if it was him. She looked closely at the young man and called his name. The young man turned and looked intently at the young lady. She was taken aback and wondered if he had heard her. A moment later, the young man came closer to her. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked who he was. He looked at her intently and said with a predatory smile that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. She looked closely at the young man, for he looked so different from when she had met him outside the church, so much so that for a moment he reminded her of the Lord. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she seemed less surprised than he had expected. The young lady stood frozen in place, not knowing what to answer. He smiled and said that he thought he would catch her off guard by knowing her name. She looked at him in confusion and asked what he was talking about. He smiled and said that he had heard a lot about her. She was Angela Risdell, a kind islander with an incredible talent for embroidery and a love of reading. Angie was surprised as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at the young man and said that he could just call her Angie. He smiled and said that his name was Mikhail Randall, and he hoped she would call him Mikhail instead of addressing him by his young Master Blackwell name. Standing outside the church, the young lady sighed heavily. A moment later, she heard someone calling her. Angie saw Michaela in front of her. He looked at her with a surprised gaze and asked what she was doing here. The young lady said with a smile that she just went out to get some fresh air. He looked at her closely and said that the atmosphere inside seemed quite heavy, and her. A moment later, he stood next to her. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. Angie looked at the young man and said that she heard that he had been suffering from a long illness. He said with a smile that he was no longer given the opportunity to hear such a thing from her, since he thought that she was not at all interested in him. The young lady looked away from him in embarrassment, since she was very nervous after his words. He looked at her intently and said that, to tell the truth, he had recently recovered and had begun to go out into society. He said sadly that at times the air he breathed felt unreal to him, just like the fact of the Duke's death, which was also hard to believe. The young lady looked at the young man intently and said that she really hoped that he would not have to suffer any more. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. Angie looked into the distance with a smile and said that, knowing that he had been in pain for so long, she could only sincerely wish that from now on he would be happy. The young man was very surprised and embarrassed by her words, but he still did not forget to thank her for her kind words. Mikhail looked at the young lady closely and said with a smile that he would be helping her around the estate today. He said that he was very pleased to see her here. He asked if she was keeping him up to date. The young lady was taken aback and said that she hardly knew more about duties than he did. He smiled and said that he was sure she was much more capable than he. The young lady looked at the young man intently. She had previously mistaken him for a lord, but now she saw that he was completely different from Kai. She understood that Kai was akin to a dark chess piece. At the same time, her new friend embodies the light of ivory figures. He looked at her intently and asked her with a smile if she would like to take a little walk. The young lady threw all her thoughts away and said with a smile that she would be happy to take a walk with him. A moment later they were walking slowly, but to her surprise, the young lady walking slowly accidentally stumbled. The young man was very scared for her and caught her with lightning speed. He looked at her puzzled and asked if she was okay. Angie froze in place, not knowing what to answer. But a moment later, she moved away from him and thanked him for catching her. Mikhail hastily said that there was nothing to thank him for. He looked at her in surprise and asked where she got the information about the rejection. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. He looked at her closely and told her to look at her hand. Angie looked at her hand in surprise and wondered what she was seeing. Angie looked puzzled and said that she didn't know what it was either. She said that she looked like she had cut herself somewhere. He looked at her closely and said that now that he had a better look at her hand, he could say with certainty that the marks he had swept away looked like needle marks. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. Mikhail looked at her longingly and said that he had a similar move. He slowly rolled up his sleeve so that she could see the truth of his words. The young lady looked at his hand in surprise and said that he was right, as they looked exactly like her marks. She was puzzled by this situation as she had never had an injection before. She wondered where she got the information from. The young man looked at her intently but said nothing. He came closer to her and asked if she minded if he took a closer look. She sighed heavily and said she didn't mind. Kai watched the young men from afar. A moment later, Jerome called out to the young master. Kai asked the manager how long the young lady would be staying here. The manager looked at the young gentleman intently and said that the young lady would be staying here for about 10 days. Kai wanted to say something about the young man, but he changed his mind. He sighed heavily and said that it would take some time to adapt. He looked into the distance and said that the future held a great many changes. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that they had been told that for the time being, they should only clean the library or do some sewing. She looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if she would like to go to breakfast together tomorrow. Angie and Annette became good friends while they were cleaning the mansion. Angie said with a smile that she would be happy to go with her. They chatted casually for a while. Annette smiled as she looked at the young lady and with a smile wished her good night and retired to her room. Angie reciprocated. She was puzzled as she did not expect that they would allocate a whole room for her. She thought that she would probably not see the young lord today. He sent her a note in which he said that he would try to come to her. She sighed heavily because she knew that today was a very long day. She knew that they had sent the man into retirement first, and then she met a man she didn't expect to see and who helped her a lot. Angie was puzzled because she didn't know where she got the marks on her hands from. She couldn't stop thinking about them. She wondered why she didn't remember anything, if the marks were really from the injections. Angie knew that as soon as she got home, they would definitely ask her mother about it. She knew that it seemed like her cold was almost gone, so she would probably be able to drink rose tea tomorrow. The young lady slowly fell asleep and heard someone calling her. She turned around and saw a man in front of her. He was shouting and asking if she could hear him. The young lady was puzzled as she saw Martin in front of her, who had appeared in her dream again. She was taken aback because she didn't remember telling him her name. He was screaming and begging her to answer if she could hear him. He wanted her to nod in response. He was asking if she really lived on the island. Angie was in shock because she couldn't speak. Martin looked at her hard and told her to think so. He said she should listen to him carefully. Martin said the roses that grew on this island contained a drug. He said she should not drink rose tea. Martin said that if she did as he said, she would be able to gradually regain her memories. He said that she should try to remember who she was. He said that she could remember everything before she came to the island. He said that she absolutely had to remember who she really was. The young lady, still half asleep, screamed and asked him to wait. She didn't want him to leave. She asked him to stay a little longer. The young gentleman took the young lady by the hand and asked with a smile if she had had a nightmare. She looked at him in surprise. Kai looked at the young lady intently and said that she broke out in a cold sweat. She looked at him with an embarrassed smile and called him by name. He smiled and said that it was him. The young lady slowly stood up and looked at him in surprise. She asked when he came to her. Kai looked timidly at the young lady and apologized for entering without an invitation. He said that he didn't expect her to be asleep already. He said he sent her that note, but he had a lot of things to take care of, so he wanted to stop by to see her for a while. He looked at her closely and asked if he had frightened her. The young lady was embarrassed by such closeness and timidly said that she was not frightened at all. She in turn was more shocked by the dream she had just seen. Martin told her that the tea contained a drug. She knew that she had to properly sort everything out. The young lady looked at her companion intently and said that what really reassured her was that when she woke up, she saw him. The young man froze in place in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. She smiled and asked for forgiveness for the room being so dark. She asked his permission to light a candle. He smiled and said that everything was fine. He said that there was no need for this as he was leaving soon, but he could stay with her for a little while longer. The young man timidly kissed her hand. The young lady was confused. She looked at him intently and asked if he was okay. She said that she was very worried about him, as he must be tired both physically and mentally. The Lord in turn did not answer. He only remembered how he saw the young lady with the young man. He looked at her intently and said that he was fine. He asked with a smile how it could be different when there was a person who cared about him so much. Kai moved closer to her and said with a smile that when his treatment was finished, he wanted her to talk to him about something. The young lady froze in surprise, as he was very close. Kai looked deeply into her enchanting eyes and said tenderly that this concerned their future. The young lady thought about yesterday for a moment. She was puzzled and wondered why the young master was such a good kisser. Then she completely lost track of time and wondered how good he was at other things. The young lady was taken aback and blushed with embarrassment. She wondered what she was even thinking about. In any case, she was very glad that his treatment was going well, but she was very curious about what he wanted to discuss with her. She remembered that he said that it concerned their future. She knew that only one thing came to her mind. Lost in her thoughts, she did not notice how she burned herself with hot tea. The young lady looked closely at the rose tea and suddenly remembered what Martin had told her to listen to him carefully. He had said that the roses that grew on the island contained a drug. She remembered that he had insistently asked her not to drink pink tea. He had said that if she did as he said, she would be able to gradually regain her memories. He said that she should try to remember who she had been before. She thought for a moment because Martin had started appearing in her dreams around the same time she had started drinking tea with honey for her cold. And now she was beginning to think that it was not just a coincidence. She didn't know whether she should believe him without proof, but she knew it certainly wouldn't hurt to stop drinking tea. The maid asked the young lady if she was ready. Angie said in a hurry that she was already on her way. She ran away with the speed of lightning without having drunk her tea. Several days passed since she stopped drinking tea. The young lady was very nervous at first because she was deceiving everyone, but over time she stopped worrying and spent her days carefree. She wanted to be brave if it would help her discover the truth, and so she believed that at the end of the long wait, there would be hope. But for her, the days flew by and she was heading back home. The lady was in shock as the memories she had lost began to surface in her mind. Angie suddenly remembered a tall, red-haired girl named Lucy Perron, and they used to embroider together. She knew the other girls didn't believe her when she spoke of the young lady. She was puzzled as if she had simply disappeared from their memories. Angie was in shock as it felt like someone had erased all traces of her existence. The young lady slowly returned to her parents' house. Madame smiled looking at her daughter. She was very glad that she had already returned. The madam told her daughter to come into the house immediately, as she must be tired after a long day of work in the mansion and a hard journey. The madam looked at her daughter and called her. The young lady in turn froze in shock looking at her mother. The madam said about her daughter that she was very pale. She asked her excitedly what had happened. The lady told her daughter that she looked very emaciated and had dark circles under her eyes. The lady was shocked by her daughter's condition. She saw that even her hair had started to fall out. Angie looked at her mother closely and said that something strange had been happening to her lately. Madame looked at her daughter puzzled and asked what she was talking about. Angie told her mother that sometimes a man appears in her dreams who always says the same thing, and he keeps telling her that she must leave the island immediately. Madame was taken aback by her daughter's words. She looked at her intently and asked what she just said. The young lady was shocked. She said that at first she thought it was just a dream, but over time she began to have a strange feeling that he was telling the truth. Angie looked at her mother closely and said that perhaps there was much they didn't know about the survivors of the war living outside the island, or about the current state of the mainland, which might already be safe. Madame looked at her daughter intently and said angrily that this would not do. Madame said that she would take her daughter to the doctor first thing tomorrow morning. Angie looked at her mother in surprise and asked why she would do that. The young lady was taken aback, pushing her mother away. She said that she was not sick at all and she just wanted to tell her about her dream. The madam looked at her daughter with fury and shouted at her to throw the absurd thoughts out of her head. Madam said that it seemed that her fantasy books were making it difficult for her to distinguish reality from fiction. She said that she thought she should stop reading them now and concentrate on her embroidery. Madame looked at Angie intently and asked if she understood her. The young lady stood frozen in place, looking at her mother in bewilderment. Angie slept quietly and peacefully in her bed. Meanwhile, Madame came to her room. She looked closely at the bottle she was holding in her hand, the bottle's contents, into the jug of water, with complete confidence. She looked at her daughter and said that they would continue to live happily on the island. She said that it would always be like this and she must know. To surrender herself into the hands of fate is the key to this happiness. The manager looked at the young gentleman intently and asked if he could sit down. The young gentleman, holding his hand, sighed heavily. He was glad that it was finally all over. The manager looked closely at the young gentleman and asked how he was feeling. Kai sighed heavily and said that he felt pretty good. A moment later, he said he was just feeling a little dizzy. The manager looked at the gentleman and said he was very glad to hear that. He also said that to tell the truth, he doubted the treatment would be effective. The Lord sighed heavily as no one knew when the madness might strike again. However, for now, he knew that it was enough. He wanted to invite Angie to his place soon, to tell her the news. Louise looked at the young lady's parents and said that it was simply impossible, since dreams were just dreams and nothing more, and the person she had seen was just a figment of her imagination. Madame looked closely at the headmaid and timidly asked if this meant that he was not a fugitive. Louise said that everyone who tried to escape from the island was caught and given the appropriate punishment. She said that of course some were lost at sea, but there was no chance that they could survive. Louise looked at the couple intently and said that if the young lady started drinking rose tea again, it should not happen again in the future. Louise looked at them intently and said that she had to ask them something. She asked if her cold was the only reason she stopped drinking rose tea. She looked closely at the couple and asked if they were sure that there was no intent. The couple froze in place at this question. The lady looked at her closely and said that it was true. Their daughter drank tea with honey, which helped to overcome the disease. She said that from now on they would certainly be more careful with her. Louise looked at them intently and said that she would give them more sedatives. She looked at them and said that as always they just needed to add them to the water. Louise said that the young lady was guaranteed to sleep soundly all night and not see dreams. Madame looked at the headmaid and thanked her. Sir looked at Louise and asked if this meant that their daughter would be okay. He said that they had heard that the Lord had excluded Angie from the list of medications before starting his treatment. Louise looked at them intently, but did not answer. A moment later, she said that it was exactly like that, and no one could convince him otherwise. Madame looked at her and asked if that meant their daughter would be safe. She said that they knew their daughter's blood was a great match for the Lord. They knew he would have to find another cure. Louise looked at them closely and said that she felt like the two of them had grown very attached to the young lady over the years. Louise said furiously that they seemed to consider themselves her real parents. Madame looked at the headmaid and said sadly that to tell the truth, the young lady had become truly dear to them, because they spent a lot of time together with her, and in this world they had not met anyone as sunny and modest as the young lady. Louise looked at them intently and said that she understood everything she said, that they had no reason to be afraid. The maid looked at the couple and said that the young master wished for the young lady to be well. The headmaid said that if she had memory problems again, they could just move on to the next step. She said they would reset her with amnesia. Wilhelm van Ametige, founder of the Ametige Steel Company, member of the Upper House of Parliament. He sat intently reading the newspaper, when suddenly there was a knock on his office door. Martin opened the door and told his father that he had come to see him. Martin looked at his father with a smile and said that it had been a long time since their last meeting. Wilhelm looked closely at the young man and said that this was indeed so, and asked him to sit down. Wilhelm looked at Martin in surprise and asked if he really needed merchant ships to go to the island. Martin said that he did, since he needed the ship for cover. Martin said that although it was a long time ago, from what he remembered, the island was not that far away. He looked closely at Wilhelm and said that any boat that could withstand a week's journey would be enough. Wilhelm looked closely at the young man and said that it would not be difficult to get it, but he wondered if everything would be all right. He was puzzled and worried that something might happen to the young man. Martin Piston looked at him and said that he should not worry because nothing dangerous would happen until he landed on the island. Wilhelm sighed heavily and said that he believed that this would be so. He looked at Martin intently and asked him if he really thought he could find the girl he had seen so often in his dreams. Martin said he couldn't be sure, but he wanted to see for himself. He looked at Wilhelm intently and said there should be no more victims. Wilhelm sighed heavily and said he hadn't seen such a stare for a long time. Martin looked at the man and shouted that he too was a victim. He said he had been kidnapped and taken to the island against his will, and probably countless other children had experienced the same thing. Martin looked at the man closely and said that he had experienced the same thing just like his daughter. The man froze in place at the words of the young man. He was shocked, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He asked if the young man realized what he had just said. Wilhelm told the young man that he accused the Duke of summoning the children to the island against their will, and he claimed that their memories were manipulated, making the people addicted to a drug grown on the island. Wilhelm looked at the young man with fury and said that he was talking complete nonsense. Wilhelm looked at the young man closely and said that he was very grateful that he had risked his life to save his daughter. He said she was simply lost and wandering around the area when she attracted the attention of some petty criminals. He said that the Duke's house is a sideline of the royal family, and their line is the most powerful on the continent. Wilhelm looked at the young man closely and said that he had no ill feelings towards them, and although he may be the richest man in Wintergard, his wealth paled in comparison to that family's fortune. He looked at the young man closely and said that he was not sure where these strange ideas came from in his head, but he would advise him to stop talking about it. Wilhelm said that since he saved his daughter, he would reward him generously. Martin shouted furiously that this was how they did things, and they targeted orphans who would not be found if they disappeared and sent them to the island as sacrifices. He looked at Wilhelm intently and asked if he remembered this. Martin said that Wilhelm's daughter was covered in mud and disheveled when she was found in the pouring rain, and those who did not know her could easily have mistaken her for an orphan. Wilhelm looked at the young man intently. Martin said that he did not need a reward at all. Martin said he only asked him for one thing, that he use the money for the benefit of the children of their country. Odin asked him to make sure that they would not be as vulnerable as he himself had once been. Martin didn't want them to be dragged to that damned island. The man looked at the boy closely and said that he could assume that his words were true. He looked at Martin and asked him why the Duke's family needed to create such a strange secret organization. Wilhelm said that if they needed one, an estate on the mainland would be a much safer option. He said that if they needed labor, they could hire much stronger people than children. Wilhelm looked at the young man intently and asked if he was wrong in this situation. Martin looked at him intently and asked if the man had heard anything about a dark ritual called eternity. Wilhelm looked at the young man puzzledly and asked what he was talking about. Martin said that about 10 years ago the Duke's house began to practice the forbidden. Martin said furiously that all he knew was that the ritual required the flesh and blood of children. He knew that it allowed one to obtain what people were never meant to desire. Mikhail looked closely at the handkerchief that the young lady presented to him. He said with a smile that it was truly an incredible gift. Angie looked at the young man with a smile and said that she wanted to repay the people she felt indebted to during her stay at the Duke's estate. She said with a smile that she was very sorry that she couldn't finish them sooner. She looked at him intently and asked him with a smile if he liked the gift. The young man smiled and said that he liked it very much as it was simply wonderful. Mikhail looked at the young lady and said with a smile that he believed she had made it not just for him. He asked if he was right. The young lady looked at him with confusion and asked what he was talking about. He smiled and said that he simply couldn't help but hope, since this was the first time she had asked to meet him and the first time she had given him a gift. The young lady was shocked because she saw that he really looked disappointed. Angie had no idea that he was really like that. He looked at her intently and said timidly with a smile that his name was not spelled quite correctly. The young lady was taken aback and asked if she had made a mistake. The young man explained to her how it should be done correctly, and the young lady in turn said that he could give it to her and she would make him a new gift. He smiled and said that everything was fine and there was no need to make a new one. He was just happy that she now knew how to spell his name. He looked at the young lady and asked if she had finished her work at the mansion. He said that from the looks of it, he would have to stay there for a while. She said with a smile that she thought so, and it seemed to her that there was nothing more she could do. Angie suddenly remembered her mother telling her that she should stop reading now and concentrate on her embroidery. From the day her mother told her about it, she stayed at home and embroidered, and for some reason Martin no longer appeared in her dreams. The young lady thought for a moment that she no longer wanted to take the tea, which was a drug. Her companion saw all the anxiety on her face, but in turn, he said nothing. She knew that there were quite possibly things she didn't know about yet. Madame looked at the headmaid and said that the master's succession ceremony would be held soon, and it would most likely be held within a few months since his treatment had already been completed. She looked at the maid and asked if this meant that he would be going to the mainland. Louise sighed heavily and said that it was so, and he must have an audience with His Majesty. Hester was very worried about Michaela's future. The head maid looked at Madame and with a smirk told her not to worry as she had everything under control. Louise said that they first needed to find new medicine for the young master and they needed to prepare for any unforeseen circumstances. She said that although the young lady's blood was most suitable, there was little they could do. She sighed heavily and said that the young master was very adamant on this matter. Louise looked at her companion intently and said that since they were talking about it, they needed to find a child that would suit them at this stage. The lady sighed heavily and told her husband about the task, but that she did not know how much longer they had to drug the young lady as it seemed wrong. Her husband looked at her and said that she should not let her determination weaken. He looked closely at his wife and said that as Louise had said, they had no reason to worry now. He looked at his wife and said that they just needed to make sure they didn't have to go to the next stage. Madame looked at her husband and asked if he hadn't noticed. Madame said that their daughter occupies a special place in the young master's heart and no companion or maid. The man froze in place in bewilderment. She asked if he had seen the gifts the young gentleman had sent her that day, and the gentleman said they were in gratitude for her hard work, but she had never heard of him sending anything like that to anyone else. Madame looked at her husband and asked if he had seen the expression on the young lady's face. Madame said that their daughter smiled shyly, interrupting in delight that her embroidery had been used to make this dress. He looked at his wife intently and said, puzzled, that she was right, but he did not understand what he and they could do in this situation. He said it was just a passing youthful infatuation, and the young master should understand that better than anyone else, considering the heavy burden that lies on his shoulders. Sir looked at his wife intently and said that he was sure that the young master would not make a reckless decision. The young lady, in turn, was in shock. She froze with indignation. Angie wondered what she had just heard. She knew that as soon as she came home, she fell asleep unusually quickly. Before this, her mother gave her water to drink and she obediently agreed. She initially wanted to believe that it was a side effect from not drinking rose tea. Later, she found a note that was hidden in the box. With the dress, the young gentleman wrote to her that his treatment was over, and he asked her to come to him in the evening. In the dress, he said that Jerome would be waiting for her at the entrance to the forest. That day, she just felt like she shouldn't drink the water her mother brought her every night, so she just pretended to be asleep. Sometime later, the young lady, having gathered herself, ran to the meeting, but in turn, she did not understand why and for what purpose they did this to her. She didn't understand why they were giving her the drug. She wondered if it was all because she told her mother about Martin. Angie didn't know if it was all because she was afraid that her relationship with the Lord could develop into something more serious. She was confused and wondered what exactly her mother had added to her water. Angie didn't understand what exactly they meant by the next step. She was in shock because it was hard for her to think straight, because there were too many things she didn't know about. She didn't know what else they were hiding from her. A moment later, she heard someone calling her, and turning around, she saw the estate manager, Jerome, looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really run away. He said she had had enough time. Jerome looked at the young lady closely and said about the task, but that she was pale. He asked if she would like to catch her breath a little. The young lady sighed heavily and in turn said that there was no need for that. She looked at the manager intently and said that she would like to see the young master soon. She knew that even if it was just for a moment, she wanted to be in his arms, leaving all her worries behind. Sometime later, the young lady arrived at the meeting place. She didn't have time to open the door before a young gentleman greeted her with a smile. He looked at her intently with a charming smile on his face and said that she had come after all. The young lady in turn looked at him with an embarrassed smile. She was very glad to see him. The young lady in turn was very glad that everything was fine with the young lord. She was a little surprised as she saw that he looked even better than before. She looked at him intently and timidly asked if he was completely cured. She asked if this meant that he would no longer suffer as he had before. Kai looked intently at his companion and said that it was so. He smiled, looking at her, and said that he was completely fine now. He slowly untied her hat, and it fell to the ground. He touched her face tenderly and said with a smile on his face that the dress suited her very well. The young lady shyly turned her gaze away from the young gentleman. He smiled and said that the dress was made especially for him. He asked with a smile on his face if she recognized the embroidery with marigolds. She, smiling, came closer to him and with a smile said that she recognized everything since she did the embroidery. She timidly said that when she embroidered it in the mansion, she could not even imagine that this embroidery would become part of her dress. He said with a smile that he would like to give her something meaningful. Angie was very embarrassed by such a gift. She thanked him with a smile. The Lord looked at the young lady intently and said that he had previously told her to call him Kai, as only she was allowed to do so. The young lady stood frozen in place in bewilderment, wondering if he didn't know what was going on. She wondered if he didn't realize what people thought of them. She wondered if he didn't notice the secrets that were hidden on the island. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she was not sure she could accept such a generous gift. Kai came even closer to her and timidly asked if she didn't know that she deserved this gift, and even more, he looked at her intently and said that he had been waiting for the day when his treatment was finally completed to tell her this. He looked at her tenderly and asked her to do him the honor of holding her in his arms today. The young gentleman tenderly and quickly took off the young lady's dress and kissed her with tender passion. Angie froze in surprise when she saw that he continued to unbutton her clothes. He looked at her intently and called out, saying that she had no need to be afraid. He said that she could push him away at any moment. Kai looked at her intently and said that he just wanted to share this with her. The young lady was embarrassed, but in turn she felt the same way. She was very eager to touch him. She knew she had more pressing matters to think about, but she couldn't hold back anymore, at least not now. She just wanted to feel his body. Kai tenderly kissed every corner of the young lady's body. He looked at the young lady intently and said tenderly that she would never know how long he had waited for this moment. After that night, they dissolved into each other again and again, wanting more. Enjoying each other, they simply could not stop as it was impossible. They enjoyed the smell, the warmth of each other's bodies, the breath of each other. The young lady looked at her companion with tears in her eyes. She was very happy as he was sweet to her. The more they got to know each other, the stronger their passion became. For endless nights, they closed each other's eyes and ears, drowning in the abyss of ecstasy. Mikhail was furious because he heard what was really going on behind the door. He angrily squeezed the handkerchief that the young lady had given him. The young lady looked at the night landscape with delight and a smile. She said with a smile that the night air was simply amazing. Kai looked at her intently and asked with a smirk if she was sure that he didn't need to carry her. Since she looked quite tired recently, the young lady was embarrassed by such words. She timidly said that she was perfectly fine. He looked at her intently and asked if it was true. She sighed heavily and said that it was, but in fact, she was completely exhausted. She had the feeling that he had become even more cunning than before. A moment later, the young man came closer to her and hugged her from behind. She was a little surprised as she did not expect him to do something like that. He looked at her with a smile and said that in that case they could take a leisurely stroll. He looked at her tenderly and said with a smile that he wanted to show her something. She froze in surprise, but a moment later, with an embarrassed smile, she said that she would like to see what he wanted to show. Turning around, Angie looked at her companion with a smile and said that he should look at these fireflies. She looked into the distance and said with a smile that there were even more of them. He came closer to her and asked with a smile what she thought of this place. He asked her if she liked the view. The young lady froze in place. She didn't expect to see something like this. A moment later, she looked into the distance with a smile and admiration and said that the view was very beautiful. Turning around, she looked intently at the young man and said with a smile that she had never seen such a mesmerizing landscape. Kai hugged his companion tenderly. He said that his father told him that they used to come here with his mother when they were not yet married. He looked at her and said with a smile that she was the first person he had brought here. The young lady froze in place. She was very surprised and at the same time confused by his words. Kai looked at her tenderly and asked if she remembered his words about there being something he was going to say after his treatment was over. Like a breath of wind that breaks the silence of the forest cover, a sudden thought arises in her head. For a second, she forgot about secrets and feelings of awkwardness. So far, no one has taken her seriously, but perhaps he will want to listen to her. The young lady, in turn, hoped that he would believe her and not question her words. He looked at her intently and said that he sometimes watched her from the top of the hill. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Kai said that he heard that on the days when she didn't come to see him, she was helping her parents in that house. The young lady looked down in surprise and saw a house on the north coast. She was surprised because she did not know that these rocks led to the estate. He looked at her intently and said that then these feelings began to grow. But a moment later he said that he must have been wrong and that it had happened even earlier. He said that he often looked at her beautiful face and he felt truly alive, looking at her from afar. He looked deep into her eyes and said with a smile that he wanted to share this joy with her. Kai's expression changed in an instant, and he asked the young lady in all seriousness if she would go to the mainland with him. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. A moment later, she slowly stepped back and timidly asked him what he meant. She did not understand how they could sail to the mainland. Since she knew that place was uninhabitable, he looked at her intently and said that he knew that she had always been told that there was still poison gas there, but it was all a lie. Kai looked at the young lady intently and said that there were countless people on the mainland building a new life. The young lady froze in place in shock as she didn't expect to hear such a thing. He said that his succession ceremony would soon be held there, and once he received the title, he intended to settle in the capital. He looked at her intently and said that he wanted to tell her a lot of things, but he had to wait until the treatment was finished. Kai looked at the young lady intently and kissed her hand. He said that he could now gradually tell her everything he said, that everything that he had neglected until now he would now do correctly. The young lady froze in shock. She could not utter a word. He looked at her intently and said with embarrassment that after all this, he really hoped that she would stay by his side. The man looked into the distance and sighed heavily. He was glad that they had finally reached their destination. He collapsed to the ground from exhaustion. Emma rushed into the room and asked the girls if they had heard the news. The girls greeted their friend. They looked at her intently and asked if she was talking about the ship that washed up on their shore. They said that they had already heard this news. She looked at them with a joyful smile. Since she thought they didn't know, Emma said that apparently the ship's captain had met with the Lord today. The captain looked at the Lord intently and said that it was truly a miracle, since they had been caught in a storm and ended up on the island. He was surprised that they had miraculously survived and ended up in the place they had been looking for so long. He looked at the Lord and said that the surrounding waters were considered impassable due to thick fog, and that was probably why this island had remained safe until now. He looked at the Lord and said with a smile that it must be just divine providence. The young lady looked at her friends and said with a smile that the captain said that the lands outside the island were now safe, although it was still hard to believe. The young ladies whispered among themselves as they were surprised. Previously, everyone thought that they were stuck on the island forever. Angie froze, not knowing what to say. She thought of the mainland because she knew that only the previous night it had been an impossible dream. She remembered her companion telling her to take her time and think things through. He said with a gentle smile that he would certainly wait for her answer. The young lady was puzzled as she thought it was a very strange coincidence, as if it were her destiny. But now she knew that some things had become clear. Now she knew that everything Martin had said was true. Angie knew that he might actually exist somewhere outside the island. She thought that most likely what he told about the pink tea was not a lie either. She understood that she saw him more in her dreams because of the effect of the new drug. She would really like to know more about this. She was a little confused as she just wanted answers to her questions. She wanted to help the young lord in any way she could. She was very sad because he had been ill for a long time. She thought that most likely he didn't know much about what was happening on the island now. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and called her. She came closer to her and said that she was very pale, and also asked if everything was okay with her. Letitia asked her friend, puzzled, if she had ever met the Lord before. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She asked her friend what she meant as she saw the worried expression on her face. Letitia said that she thought she had no reason for it, and it was unlikely that such a thing could have happened. The young lady was alarmed and did not understand why her friend suddenly mentioned the Lord. She knew she couldn't ask her why she asked such a question. She was puzzled as she had never seen her friend so frightened and worried before. The young lady looked at her friend intently and said with a smile that if she needed any help, she could easily contact her. Angie looked at her friend and said that no matter what happened, she would always help her in any situation. The young lady in turn thanked her friend with a smile for her care and kindness. She looked at her closely and said with a smile that Angie was right and she was the person she cherished most in this world. The young lady in turn was puzzled and wondered why she had not realized this. Then at that moment she had made a huge mistake. The young lord looked closely at the paintings and called the manager. He said that sometimes he finds himself imagining his mother's gaze. He said he could see his mother looking at his father through the raging flames on the day she found out. He thought of the words she would shout at him, her face so pale it would be as if there wasn't a drop of blood left in it. He knew that his father truly loved his mother, but unfortunately he realized this too late. Kai sighed heavily and said that perhaps that was why he was so determined not to do anything he might regret later. He looked closely at the manager and said that he had served his father faithfully. Kai looked at Jerome intently and said that he would not hold it against him if he decided to leave him. Kai looked at him intently and said that however, if he stayed near him, he might suffer the consequences. Kai looked at Jerome intently and asked if he understood. This Jerome in turn looked at the young master intently, but did not answer. A moment later he bowed and said that he respected both his wishes and those of his father so that he should devote himself entirely to serving the family. The headmaid stood quietly at a distance and listened to their conversation. She understood that things would not go this way, because if everything continued in the same spirit, it would become a very big problem for them. She thought that she could solve all the problems if she acted first. The young man stood at a distance and closely watched everything that was happening. 2 weeks later, there was a celebration at the estate. Everyone was surprised as they saw a beautiful and simply magnificent view. The young lady in turn saw her friends in the distance and greeted them with a smile. She was glad because Kai's succession ceremony was finally officially announced. He was to travel to the mainland with the sailors to receive the title, and before his departure, a 3-day banquet was organized for the islanders. Surprisingly, people did not seem to be afraid of the mainland, rather they seemed interested in the idea of the unknown and the world. There was also a sense of anticipation in the air as they were eager to see the face of the future duke, which had been kept secret until now. The young lady in turn thought that perhaps people were still simply trying to suppress their curiosity about Kai and the continent, because that was what was expected of them, and she thought that Kai probably had it no easier all this time. A moment later, she was taken aback and turned around as she heard someone calling her. The young lady looked at the manager in surprise as she did not understand what he wanted from her. Jerome looked at her intently and asked if she could come with him for a minute. The young lady in turn wondered if Kai really wanted to see her. She looked closely at the manager and said that of course she would go with him. Angie turned around and looked at her friends and said with a smile that she would be back soon. The young ladies smiled and said that they would watch the festival from this place. The young lady walked slowly behind the manager. She did not see anyone around her. Harold Durbin, treasurer and administrative manager of the Blackwell House, watched the guests with a smirk and amusement. He looked at his daughter intently and said that he hoped she was ready. He told her with fury to remember that mistakes of any kind were not allowed. He came closer to her and said with fury that the future of their family lay on her shoulders. The young lady in turn was taken aback and froze in place from her father's words. Louise approached the young men and greeted them with a grin. She said with a sly smile that she had been waiting for them very much. Harold in turn looked intently at the headmaid and also greeted her with a smile. He looked at her intently and asked if they were really going to go to the Lord straight away. The maid said that it was not so, and today they would just discuss a few things. The young lady slowly followed them. The father looked at his daughter with anger and asked why she froze in place. He told her to follow him immediately. The young lady obeyed her father. The manager looked closely at the young lady and pointed her in the right direction. A moment later, the young lord called out to the young lady. Angie turned around and saw him in all his glory. He smiled and said that she didn't need to worry, as no one would be coming to them. Kai hugged the young lady tightly and said with a smile that he missed her very much. The young lady pushed him away in alarm and asked if he was sure he had time to meet her, as he must be very busy. Kai looked at the young lady with an embarrassed smile and said that he was more interested in nothing than being here with her. The young lady in turn was very much embarrassed by his words. She looked at him intently and said that she had been thinking about his words for some time. She said she was thinking exactly about what he had said then on the cliff when the fireflies were circling around them, when he had asked the young lady if she would go with him to the mainland. She knew she would be lying if she said she wasn't afraid, but still the thought occurred to her that long before Kai had spoken of the mainland, before she had met Martin, or even before that, when she had learned that there was someone interested in things beyond the island, perhaps she had already foreseen the moment when she would enter a new world. The moment she heard Kai's words, the first emotion she felt was delight. She knew that if she could leave from there with Kai, if fate gave her such a chance, she would prefer to go with him. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she really wanted to go to the mainland with him. The young lord froze in surprise, but a moment later he called out to her. He looked at the young lady and said that his heart was heavy, that she would have to leave her friends and parents. He looked at her and said quietly that she did not need to worry. Kai said that it might take time, but he would make sure that those she loved could settle in the capital. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if it was true. He smiled and said that it was so, and the young lady in turn was very happy. He looked at her intently and said that it was his turn. A moment later, he opened the box in front of her. The young lady looked at the contents in surprise and asked what it was. He smiled and said that he would like to give her a sacred tear, as this treasure was passed down in his family from generation to generation through the female line. He said that his father had given it to his mother, and now he wanted to give it to her. The young lady was surprised. She looked at her companion with embarrassment and said that she was not sure that she could accept this gift. He looked at her intently and said that he no longer intended to change this jewel to anyone else. He said that it would go only to her. Kai looked at her closely and said with a smile that he was originally going to give her a necklace and a ring, but tradition dictated that they exchange rings when they said their vows. The young lady froze in surprise. Angie was confused by his words. She looked at him intently and asked if he was sure. The young man froze in place as he did not understand what she was talking about. She sighed heavily and said that she had nothing to offer him. She said that he was from the house of the dukes of the collateral line of the imperial family. She didn't have time to finish speaking as they heard a noise in the distance. A moment later, the manager approached them and, asking the gentleman for forgiveness, said that it was time for him to go. Kai came to his senses for a moment and said that he had completely lost track of time, but a moment later, he handed the young lady a letter and with a smile said that she must read it. He said that the letter contained everything he wanted to tell her, and it contained all the answers she wanted to receive. He slowly approached her and kissed her tenderly. Kai said that he would soon contact her again. The young lady was embarrassed by such closeness. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that by then they would need to start preparing to leave the island. The young lady slowly hid the letter in her dress, breathing heavily as her heart was still pounding. Whenever she was around Kai, she felt like she was floating on the clouds. A moment later, she looked into the distance as she heard someone calling her incessantly. Turning around, she saw her friend who was looking at her, breathing heavily. The young man looked at her intently and said that he had finally found her. He came closer to her and said that they had no time to lose and she must come with him at once. The young lady was puzzled. She looked at him intently and asked what was going on. He sighed heavily and told her that her friend seemed to be in trouble. After Angie heard that her friend was in trouble, she ran to her at full speed. When she came running, she saw a young lady sitting on the ground and crying loudly. Angie ran closer to her and asked if she was okay. Angie said she thought Letitia wouldn't be able to attend the banquet today. The young lady wanted to touch her friend and comfort her, but she pushed her away. Angie froze in place in surprise as she did not expect such a thing. Letitia looked at her friend with fury and asked why she had lied to her. Letitia looked at her friend with fury and said that she had asked her earlier. Letitia was very angry with her friend because she wanted to know if she had met the Lord. Angie froze in bewilderment. She didn't understand what this all meant. She looked intently at her friend, dumbfounded, frozen in place, and called out to her. She remembered the moment when her friend asked her if she had ever met a lord before. Then Angie was puzzled by such a question and asked her friend what she meant. Letitia said that she thought she simply had no reason for it, and it was unlikely that such a thing could happen. Angie looked at her friend closely and asked, "Did she really come to the banquet today to meet the Lord?" Letitia furiously told her friend that she knew nothing and had no idea how much she wanted to escape. Letitia told father in a trembling voice that she doubted whether she was doing the right thing. She was very scared and she was shaking. She didn't want to meet the Lord at all. She knew that earlier everyone said that he had an ugly face like a monster. Letitia looked at her father intently and asked in a trembling voice, "Is it really too late to change your mind?" The man looked at his daughter with fury as he did not understand why she was now ruining all his plans. The headmaid looked at the young lady intently and told her not to talk nonsense. The maid looked at the lady intently and said that her friend Angie had volunteered to take on this role before her. The young lady froze in shock as she didn't expect to hear something like that. She looked at the maid intently and asked what she was talking about. Letitia looked sideways at her friend and asked what the Lord was like. She sighed heavily and told her friend that she doubted she would answer her after so many years of keeping this secret from her. Angie walked up to her friend in shock. She wanted to comfort her and talk to her. Letitia, with tears in her eyes, told her friend to get away from her immediately as she didn't want to see her right now. Angie looked at her in surprise as she did not understand why everything was happening like this, but the young lady in turn furiously shouted at her friend to get out immediately. Mikhail came closer to the young lady and gently hugged her shoulder. He called her, while he saw the envelope in which there was a letter and took it. He looked hard at the young lady and said he thought she should come with him. He said, Angie, that her friend would be taken care of Letitia and there was no more reason to worry. The young lady stared after her friend, puzzled and very worried. The madam looked closely at her daughter and asked if she was feeling better, yet she was puzzled by her daughter's condition, as it did not look like the temperature would go down anytime soon. The lady was in shock and simply could not believe that she had fallen ill in the middle of summer. After the banquet, she tried many times to see her friend, but all in vain. Her friend refused her every time. In fact, the young lady had shut herself off from everyone, and Angie in turn was very puzzled, since at that moment she had lost the letter that Kyle had given her, and after everything that happened she fell ill with illness. The lady looked at her husband and said that their daughter was better, but they should still keep an eye on her. He looked at his wife and said that he had brought medicine from the doctor. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed that animal corpses were being found near the forest again. Madame was shocked as animal carcasses were also found near the north coast. She knew that several months had passed since the last such incident. Sir looked closely at his wife and said that he accidentally overheard when he was in church that Letitia and the Lord would soon be engaged. Madame was shocked by what she heard. The young lady looked at her parents in surprise and asked what they were talking about. She froze in shock and a moment later, looking at her parents, asked what all this meant. She looked at them intently and asked in shock if Letitia and the Lord would really get engaged. Angie looked at us at his father and asked in shock if this was true. She looked at her parents and asked if the Duke's house had officially announced this. She was in shock and wondered if the Lord himself knew about all this. She looked at her parents with a keen gaze, but she was clouded. She saw how the fog was enveloping her from within. A moment later, she fell unconscious on the bed. Her parents were in shock. They screamed and called for their daughter, but all in vain. The young lady in turn was sure that all they had to do was walk forward hand in hand. She was in shock and wondered where it all went wrong. The young man looked intently at his grandmother and called her with a smile, "Catherine Wynne." Martin's grandmother sat quietly on the threshold of her house and slowly knitted. She looked at her grandson in surprise with a smile on her face. Martin greeted his grandmother with a smile and said that they had come to see her. Madame smiled and greeted him, calling him Philippe. Martin came closer to her and kissed her tenderly on the cheek. He asked her with a smile how she chewed and said that it was still strange for him to hear her call him by that name. She said with a smile that Philippe was his name. Madame did not understand what was strange about it. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that for many years he had not even guessed about it. The young lady in turn also greeted the madam with a smile on her face. She smiled and said that her name was Bryn. The lady looked closely at the madam and with a smile on her face asked if she remembered her. The madam in turn frowned at the young lady and said that she knew Brianna, the daughter of the shopkeeper. Martin looked at his grandmother with a puzzled expression and said with a smile that she was his fiancée and he had already brought her here several times. Martin looked closely at his grandmother and wondered if she was okay. He noticed that her memory problems seemed to have gotten worse. He looked closely at her and, taking her hands with a smile, said that from now on he would visit her more often. The young lady also came closer to them and said with a smile that she and Martin would come to her. Madame smiled and said that it would be wonderful to see their sweet faces more often. Martin told his grandmother with a smile that he had come to help her with the housework. He asked her to tell him what she wanted him to do. Martin was slowly cleaning the house. He froze in place when he saw a beautiful picture. He looked closely at his bride and also at his grandmother. It still seemed unreal to him. He couldn't believe that he could just enjoy such ordinary days. 9 years ago, he risked his life to escape the island. Having adopted a wandering lifestyle, he crossed paths with his fiancée. At that moment, he instinctively felt the need to save her. Now, he has left those nightmarish memories behind. The young people began a new life, which they enjoyed continuously. With Wilhelm's help, he managed to find his long-lost grandmother. Now he knew that all this time he should have been called Philip. He came closer because he saw the photographs. The lady looked at her grandson and said with a smile that he had in his hands the only surviving photograph. The others were burned during the war. She looked closely at the photo and said with a smile that they had a similar aura. Martin looked at her in bewilderment. Madame said that his fiancée and his sister had a similar aura. Martin looked at his grandmother in shock and asked what she was talking about. He asked if he really had a sister. Madame looked at him in surprise and asked if he really didn't know about it. Martin said in confusion that he still hadn't fully regained his memories. The lady looked at her grandson with puzzlement and said that she did not know about it. She asked him for forgiveness. She told him that he had a twin sister. Madame said she was a lovely, happy girl with eyes like his own, and if she remembered correctly, the young lady's name was Amber Wynne. Martin froze in place in shock. The lady smiled as she looked at her grandson and said that the two of them loved to sing a song from their hometown. She asked her grandson if he remembered it. A moment later, the madam was humming a song to her grandson with a smile on her face. Martin froze in shock as he remembered the song. Memories from his childhood when he was with his sister came flooding back to him. He looked at his sister and said with a smile that she sang the song beautifully, and next time he promises that he will teach her a new song. She asked with a smile if it was true. The young lady with a radiant smile said that he could not take back his words. He smiled and said that of course he would not take his words back and would definitely teach. Martin was shocked as memories suddenly came flooding back to him and he remembered his sister. Now he understood everything and his puzzle was complete. The lady approached her groom and called him in a puzzled tone. She saw that he was very worried. He looked intently at his bride and said that he had just remembered everything. The young man looked intently at his companion and asked in bewilderment how much longer he would have to wait for his moment. He said that perhaps everything would soon get better here. The lady looked closely at the young man and, sighing heavily, said that it seemed he still had not gotten rid of this habit. He looked at her and said that she didn't need to change the subject. He said that all these years he had kept a low profile and pretended to be ill until the Duke died. He looked at his aunt and asked if it was not time to reveal the truth. She looked at him and said that she had recently spoken to Mrs. Dunst. The young man froze in place in surprise. She looked closely at her nephew and said that it seemed that the lady had plans for the young lord's engagement. She said that orders might be given soon, and he just had to wait until then. She looked at him intently and would have liked to say something, but suddenly the young man saw a young lady in the distance. He glanced sideways at his aunt and said that he would leave first. She looked into the distance in bewilderment. He asked her to tell him the rest next time. Madame looked after him intently. She sighed heavily because she knew that his instincts could lead him into serious trouble. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was all right, as he had heard earlier that she had been ill for some time. The young lady sighed heavily and looked puzzled, saying that she did not know if she was all right as the fever was gone, but she still felt weak and had not heard anything from her friend since that night. She was very sad, but since her friend had completely shut her out, she was puzzled as she still found it difficult to believe everything that was happening. She wondered how this was even possible. She didn't know if it was all a lie, what the Lord had told her. The comfort he gave her and every promise he made her, she wondered if it was all just a lie. The young lady in turn very much wanted to believe that there were circumstances beyond his control, but she found it difficult to convince even herself of this. The young man looked closely at his companion. He saw that she was very puzzled, and she was trembling. A moment later, looking at the young lady, he said that if it were him, he would never leave her. Mikhail approached the young lady and looked into her eyes with tenderness. He smiled and said that he would look into her eyes and share his warmth whenever she needed it. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked dumbfounded what he meant by that. He came even closer to her and asked if she really didn't understand what he was talking about. Mikhail said with a sly smile that he could brighten up her loneliness. The young lady froze in shock, as she was not ready to hear something like that. He looked deep into her beautiful green eyes and said that nothing else mattered. The young lady was shocked. She wondered if he really meant to say that he liked her. He angrily asked who he thought he was to say such things. The young lady was shocked as she didn't expect to see the young lord now. She stared at his angry face and fierce gaze. Kai looked at the young man with rage and said that it was very funny that he considered himself a worthy replacement. Kai didn't understand how the young man dared to say something like that. Kai looked at him with fury and said that this was his first and last warning. He came closer to the young man and said that from now on he should not approach the young lady. Mikhail looked at the young lord intently and asked if the young lady knew how dangerous he was. Angie froze in confusion as she did not understand what they were talking about. The young man looked at the lord intently and said with fury that all this time he had been misleading an innocent young girl. The lord asked with fury what he was talking about. Kai was furious and did not understand how the young man dared to speak to him in such a way. The young lady, in turn, stood between them and told them to stop quarreling. She looked at the lord intently and asked, puzzled, what would happen if someone saw him like this. She told her companion that he still had to formally appear before the island's inhabitants. The lord looked at her intently. He was surprised and did not expect to hear such a thing. But a moment later, he put his arm around the young lady and led her in a different direction. He looked at her intently and said that she should come with him. The young man looked after them intently without saying a word. The young lady looked back one last time and looked intently at her friend. She asked for forgiveness and left with the Lord. The young man only looked after her intently and wished her a safe journey. Sometime later they were riding together in a carriage. The Lord looked sideways at his companion and asked why she had not come to their meeting place. He sighed heavily and, looking at his companion, said that he waited for her every night. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Kai looked at her intently and asked if she hadn't read his letter. The young lady suddenly remembered the letter he had given her on that fateful day. She sighed heavily and said that unfortunately she lost it the same night she received it. He sighed heavily and said that there seemed to be a misunderstanding, and he asked her permission to explain everything to her. Angie looked at the Lord with a puzzled look and asked if it would change the fact that he was going to get engaged to Letitia. The Lord was shocked as he realized that she knew about everything. She sighed heavily and, turning away, said that she was right. The young lady was puzzled as she now realized that the rumors were not false, and it really was so. She now realized that everything was beginning to become clear, from the place and time of the engagement ceremony to all the subsequent plans. It seemed to her that everyone was happy except her, and it made her feel as if the time they spent together meant nothing. She knew that in the end her very existence would be of no use to anyone. She sighed heavily and said that soon she would return to him the brooch that he had given her, since it would be more correct if the family heirloom went to the future Duchess. Kai was taken aback and froze in place. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He looked at her with fury and shouted. He did not understand how she could say such a thing. He shouted that this brooch was her property. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he did not love Letitia at all. He said that, as he had written in his letter, this marriage was only a matter of convenience. He said that lately many eyes had been directed at them. Kai said that they needed to go to the capital quickly. He wanted to take the young lady's hand, but she pushed him away. She looked at the young man with fury and asked if he was really offering her to become his mistress. She asked if it would be like that while she worked as a maid in his capital mansion. The young lord looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression and asked her not to speak like that. He shouted that such a thing would never happen, and he would make sure that she had her own home there. He said that she would not have to interact with anyone else from the Blackwell house, and no one would be able to lay a finger on her. He looked at her intently and said that there were reasons why he should become engaged to the young lady. She covered her face with her hands as she was very hurt by his words. She said that if she had known about this in advance, she would never have contacted him. The young gentleman looked intently at his companion. He froze in place as he was not ready to hear something like this. She sighed heavily and said that she had done everything possible not to fall in love with him. She said that if she hadn't succeeded, she would never have shown him her true feelings. Kai was shocked. He stared at the young lady without saying a word. Angie said that it was time for her to go. She stood up and wanted to leave, but the young lord called her. A moment later, the young lady heard Jerome's voice and froze in place. Kai blocked her way and, asking for forgiveness, said that he simply could not let her leave. She was in shock and did not know what to do, as she did not expect such a situation to occur. He looked at her intently and said that they still had a lot to discuss. The young lady froze in place as she was very scared. She saw that his face had changed and he was scaring her. She looked at him in surprise and called him. She did not understand what he intended to do. But a moment later, everything began to swim before her eyes. A moment later, Jerome finally burst into the carriage and asked the gentleman for forgiveness. The manager froze in place from what he saw. Kai, without looking up at the manager, asked if anyone had seen their crew. He looked at Jerome with fury and said that they needed to get back to the mansion, and they needed to do it immediately. The boy looked at the man intently and said that they should take advantage of the chance when the fog cleared. He looked at the captain intently and asked what they should do. The captain looked at the young man in surprise and asked if he was planning to just find the island and get closer to it. The young man said that he was, and that was their goal for now. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately there might be problems due to the storm, but he couldn't miss such an opportunity. The captain said that they could set sail before the storm came and drop anchor at a rocky islet nearby, and then they could look for the island as soon as the fog cleared. The captain said that everything depended on whether he could survive the storm. The young man looked at the captain intently and said that it would not be a problem. He in turn knew that he had to find her. He wanted to find his sister. The young lady woke up with a pain all over her body. For a moment, she thought about Martin. She was shocked and very confused as he said he would look for her. A moment later, she looked back as she did not understand where she was. The young lord looked at her intently and asked if she was already awake. Angie froze in bewilderment as she did not expect to see him in front of her. She looked closely at the young lord and he seemed very exhausted to her. She didn't understand what was going on at all. Kai looked at her intently, not letting her say a word. He asked for forgiveness and said that this was the best thing he could do for her. He slowly walked closer to the young lady and, looking into her eyes, said that, as he had already said, there were many people watching her who wished her harm. He looked at her closely and said that she was safe here, so she need not worry. The young lady in turn looked at him intently and in a trembling voice asked him to let her go home. Angie asked the young lord if it wouldn't be enough to just avoid communicating with him. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She looked at him intently and said that the people hunting her wanted to prevent her from becoming a hindrance to him. Angie said she wouldn't change her mind no matter what. He said. She looked at him hard and said she would stay on the island so that it wouldn't happen. The young lady said that she would continue to live her current life with her parents, and he should go to the capital and take up his duties. The young man froze, looking at the young lady. She said that the ceremony of inheritance and engagement of marriage awaited him. He looked at her intently and said with sadness in his voice that he was very sorry. He looked at the young lady with annoyance and longing and said that it was too late. Kyle said that it was too late since they confessed their feelings to each other. He said that it was simply impossible since she came to him herself. As he left, he looked intently at the young lady and asked her not to leave him. Angie was in shock because he left and she remained in the room. She wanted him to let her go, but all conversations were in vain. Mikhail looked at Madame in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He asked Madame in surprise if the young lady had really gone to help with the extension of the Lord's house. The lady sighed heavily, looking at the young man, and asked if he didn't know yet. She said that she was called urgently last night because the Lord needed help as he was preparing for his engagement. Madame told the young man that she heard about it from Jerome after the fact. The young man sighed heavily and said that he understood everything. A moment later, he looked at Madame with a smile and thanked her for telling him everything. He thought for a moment and said that in that case, he would have to go and find the young lady himself. The young lady was puzzled as she did not know how many days she had been in the estate. The young gentleman came to her every night and silently watched her. She saw that his gaze said that he wanted to get the answer that she could never give him. She cried and screamed with anger, but it was all useless. One day she tried to end it all, but he stopped her. For some time he sat with his face buried in her shoulder, and she meanwhile burst into bitter tears. It seemed to her that he was crying silently. He looked at the young lady intently and said that his mother had become the sacrificial lamb for the curse that his grandfather had created. He said it was so vile and terrible that it was impossible to imagine, but his grandfather called it the greatest miracle. Having witnessed the true nature of the curse, Father decided to keep it all a secret from Mother. Madame looked at her husband in bewilderment and asked if everything written in the documents was true. The Duke in turn could not hide the truth from her for long. The lady looked at her husband with tears in her eyes and asked how he could do such vile things. The Duke shouted to his wife and called her. He wanted to explain and tell her everything, but she in turn shouted for him not to come near her. She burst into tears and screamed that she would never forgive him even after her death. Kai looked at the young lady intently and said with sadness in his voice that his father lived the rest of his days regretting everything, and he grew up knowing the weight of that burden. Kai looked at the young lady intently, holding her hand in his, and said sadly that he didn't want to experience the same regret as his father. He looked closely at the young lady and saw the marks on her arms from the needle. He looked closely into her enchanting and dazzling eyes, and with a gentle smile said that he would not let the salvation that she had given him go to waste. The Lord looked at the maid and told her to prepare food that could be easily swallowed, warm water and milk. The maid said that she would do everything. The head maid looked at the young master and said that he ended up bringing the girl to their manor. Kyle sighed heavily and looked at the maid. He said that if he hadn't done that, someone would have tried to harm her. The head maid looked at the master with a smirk and asked who would dare to do such a thing. Kyle said it could be a fanatic who believes in Kylum and is eager to get his hands on the cure, or one of the servants who thinks the young lady is a nuisance. The young master looked at the maid intently and said that she did not need to worry, and since he would leave the island as soon as the storm subsided and complete his plans regarding the engagement, but he would do all this only on one condition. As he was leaving, he asked the head maid if there were any more amnesiac vials in the estate. He said that she should destroy every single one of them. Louise was shocked, as she didn't expect to hear something like that. The young gentleman looked at her with Savruga and said that if she disobeyed the order now, there would be no further negotiations. Louise didn't understand why it had to be her. Kyle looked at her and asked if she really didn't know. He said that when they couldn't find a suitable cure, Lady was chosen after much thought, and he was sure that Louise knew the reason for this better than anyone else. Kai looked at her and said that she had said earlier that this time, with the vitality that the young lady possessed, it was worth striving for change, and she was convinced that the young lady would like him. He sighed heavily and said that this was the true reason. Mikhail listened intently to their conversation in the distance. The young lady woke up and didn't feel very well. She was confused because she felt very nauseous. She wondered if it was because she hadn't eaten anything yet. She didn't understand why she felt so bad. She thought for a moment and wondered when she had her last period. She froze in place as she heard someone enter the room. She was very scared because she knew that if they brought her food, they would simply leave it near her bed. But a moment later, she heard a familiar voice. A moment later, she saw her friend in front of her. She was surprised as she did not expect to see him in this room. She looked at him in surprise and puzzlement, but asked how he ended up there. He looked at her intently and said that the maid had told him that she had been locked up here. The young lady's eyes fell as she was very ashamed that he saw her in such a state. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if the keys to the shackles were with the Lord. The young lady said that was not the case and that they were on the table. The young man slowly walked up to the table and took the key. He looked closely at Angie and said that the Lord was currently on the dock. He looked at the young lady and said that there seemed to be a problem with the ship heading to the mainland. He slowly freed her from the shackles. The young lady froze for a moment and listened. Mikhail looked at the young lady's hands with pity and longing. A moment later, he said that they unfortunately had little time. He looked at the young lady intently and suggested that she leave this estate as soon as possible. He also said that they could discuss everything later. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really wanted her to leave this place. He looked at her and said that if she was against it and wanted to stay, then he would do so. The young lady in turn interrupted him, and not letting him finish speaking, said that this was not so. With her eyes lowered to the floor, she said that she really wanted to leave. She looked at him intently and said that she had to do it immediately. A moment later, they were running in a hurry to leave the estate as quickly as possible. A few minutes later, they finally managed to leave the estate. The young lady stood in the pouring rain and breathed heavily. Angie looked at her friend and said that she could handle this on her own from now on, and that he should still return to the estate. Angie said that if she walked through the forest to get to the cliff, the north coast would be right in front of her, and as soon as her parents arrived, she would be perfectly safe. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he would take her there as it was his day off anyway. He hugged the young lady tenderly and said that she could hardly stand on her feet. Angie asked if he could walk her to the north shore. She looked at him intently and thanked him. The young man touched her face tenderly and, looking into her beautiful eyes, said that he was happy to help her. She froze as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He sighed heavily and said that there was something he had to tell her when they got home. The young man slowly wrapped the young lady in a blanket and said that he would go get some warm tea. A moment later, he came up to her and presented her with tea. She looked at him in surprise and puzzlement, asking if he was sure he didn't need to go back. He smiled and said she didn't need to worry about that, as everyone was busy with the ship right now. He looked at her and asked how long she had been locked in the room. The young lady turned her sad gaze away from the young man and said that she did not know, but approximately up to 5 days. Mikhail sighed heavily and said that it must have started that night. The young lady looked at her friend intently and said that the Lord wanted her to go with him to the capital, but she refused. She sighed heavily and said that was the reason she was there. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she planned to do next, as he knew that the Lord would not leave it like that. She said that she was going to tell her parents everything when they came home. She said that maybe this island belonged to the Lord and they were just working for him, but if her parents wanted her to be here, there was nothing he could do about it. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't know what he was thinking, but he wouldn't dare disturb the peace of the village. The young man looked at the young lady intently, but said nothing. A moment later, looking at her, he said that the island and its inhabitants were not as peaceful and innocent as she thought, although they tried to make this place look like paradise. The young lady was taken aback, and looking at him with a surprised look, asked what he wanted to say with these words. He looked at her and said that the strange things that had happened to her up until now were all connected with the Black Mass. The young lady froze in bewilderment. He said that she knew that the Lord's house had gathered all the survivors of the war. He said that it was very strange and everything was planned from the very beginning. He said that it was all because those people were monsters who had been cursed. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise. She was shocked and asked him to wait a little. She couldn't digest what he told her. Angie looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about now. He said he had listened to the conversation between Mrs. Dunst and her closest assistants. He said that they just call their people like them just medicine, the rest for them just assistants who work for the Lord's house. He looked at her intently and said that he was going to tell her the whole truth, so she should believe what he was about to tell her. The young lady froze in shock. She asked if what he said was true. Angie looked at him intently and asked if the ritual of the Black Mass called eternity had been held since the reign of the previous duke. She asked if medicine had to be sacrificed in this ritual. The young man looked at the young lady and said that unfortunately all medicines were called that because they were used as a cure in this ritual. Mikhail sadly said that he heard that all this was for the sake of achieving immortality and eternal life. The young lady was taken aback, frozen in shock. She asked what he was talking about now. She knew it was very hard to believe, but she still put all the facts together. She remembered what they talked about in church, and she also remembered what her parents talked about. She understood that everyone had lied to her, and what had happened up until now was starting to make sense. She looked at him and asked if he had really said that the drug in the rose chala was called opium rose. The young man said that it was exactly like that, and apparently long-term use of it leads to gradual memory loss. He said the drug did not appear to affect adults who worked as helpers because they had developed strong immunity. The young lady asked her friend with sadness and longing how exactly the medicines were sacrificed. She looked at the young man in surprise and bewilderment and said that everything was fine with them now. She said that the friends with whom she embroidered were her friends who went to church services. He interrupted her and, looking intently into her eyes, asked if she really believed this. The young man came closer to her and told her to look at his hand. The young lady froze in shock. He looked at her intently and said that he had told her that it was because of his illness, but he had been in the same boat with her from the beginning. He said sadly that they had no memory of it. She came closer to him and touched him, said that several of her friends had recently disappeared. She asked, could something have happened to them as soon as they lived themselves as a medicine? He sighed heavily and said that he did not know. Without looking at the young lady, he said that people could be evicted from the island after they completely lost their memories. He looked closely at the young lady and said that he was convinced that the people from the Lord's house knew how to get off this island. He said that they simply did not allow people to swim away from the island. They needed to keep the island in complete isolation. She looked at her friend closely and asked if she understood correctly that Elliot was killed by monstrous fish and sharks. He looked at her intently and said that it was a simple lie invented by the House of Lord. He looked at her intently and said that someone had been watching the windmills and that this person had killed Elliot before mutilating his body. The young lady was shocked by what she heard. She did not understand how they could do something so cruel. He came closer to her and said that these people were simply disgusting. Their cruelty was beyond their imagination. He said that they had only one way out. He looked at the young lady intently and said in all seriousness that they should go to the capital together. The young lady froze in place. She didn't know what to answer. He said that this might be their only chance to escape. He said that this was definitely her last chance. She sighed heavily and said that if they went there, the Lord would definitely find them. Angie was shocked because she understood that if her friend's words were true, then Kai should have known about everything from the very beginning. Mikhail gently stroked the young lady's face and asked if she was okay. He looked at her closely and said with a gentle smile that if she was worried about her parents, then she should make it a condition that she would only leave if they accompanied her. He said that once in the capital, she could look for an opportunity to go somewhere far away, and from there she could escape to any point in the world. He said that she could cross the border. The young lady looked closely at her friend and asked when the ship would sail. He said that it was planned that he would sail as soon as the storm was over, but he would probably be delayed for a few more days as there seemed to be some minor problems with the ship. He said that in the meantime, she should prepare to sail and try to convince her parents. He looked hard at the young lady and said that if she told them it was his order, they would probably agree. She said that everything they had just talked about she intended to keep a secret from her parents. She knew that the Lord's house was using her parents, and she didn't want to tell them anything that would shock them. He looked at her intently and said that he agreed with her words. He said that she could always inform them when she arrived in the capital. A moment later they heard a crash and looked warily at the door. At this time the ship was raging on the waves during a storm. There was a commotion on the ship as 2 more people were needed on deck. The captain looked closely at Martin and asked with a smile if he was all right. The captain sighed with relief and said that it was very good that he was not seasick. Martin smiled and said that was it for now. He looked at the captain and asked with a smile if everything was okay with him. The captain smiled and said that worse had happened, so it was just nonsense. The captain looked at the young man closely and said that they needed to hold out a little longer. As soon as the rain stopped, they would be able to quickly find the island. Martin was very happy with this news. He in turn prayed every time that his sister would be safe. He hoped that God would protect her until he got to her. A moment later, the couple entered the house and looked at the young people in surprise as they did not expect to see them in the house. The lady looked at her daughter with puzzlement and asked what the 2 of them were doing in the house. The young man greeted the couple with a smile. He said that the young lady had already finished her embroidery. He said with a smile that since it was raining heavily, they decided to wait for them here. Madame looked closely at the young man and said that now she understood everything. The madam approached her daughter and looked at her face in surprise. She did not understand why it looked so exhausted. She asked her daughter if she was overtired. The young lady looked at her mother with tears in her eyes and called her, but a moment later she hugged her tightly. Madame looked at her daughter and said that she must have had a very hard time. Sir told his daughter that they had brought some homemade soup so that she could have some food before going to bed. He looked at the young man and said that he was probably hungry too. He asked why he didn't eat with them before leaving. The young man thanked them for their concern, but said that he needed to return to the estate. He said with a smile that he had the day off today, but it looked like they needed extra hands because of the storm. The young lady looked closely at the young man and called him softly. He looked at her sideways and said with a smile that he was fine. He looked at the young lady intently as he left and gave her a smile, saying that he would come another time, so she needed to have a good rest. Now Angie thanked him for his care and help. The spouses looked at each other as they were very anxious. Madame in turn froze in thought. The headmaid looked at the couple closely and said that it was probably all for the best, since if the Lord settled in the capital, their daughter would forget about him and live happily with him. She looked at them intently and asked if this wasn't the perfect ending. Madame knew that if their daughter took amnesiac, it would be for the best for her and she would not live in torment. She said that her life would be hard if she stayed with the Lord, but everything would be fine if she remained under their care. The headmaid looked at them intently and said that she understood. She said that she had to inform the Lord so they should continue to act as usual. The young man returned to the estate in a hurry. The headmaid looked at the young man intently and said that orders had been given to get rid of this. When the thunder roared, she said that it was very important that he play his part properly. He ran up to the estate and sighed heavily. He looked at the estate with a grin and said that the Lord would never get what he wanted. The young gentleman looked at the man intently and asked if there was no other way. The man, asking the Lord for forgiveness, said that the earliest it would be was a week. The Lord sighed heavily and said that he understood and nothing could be done. Jerome looked at the Lord closely and said that it would be safer to sail after the storm was over, but if the fog cleared by then, people might suspect something. He did not see how the Lord could get out of this situation. The Lord looked at the manager intently and said that it was impossible to continue to deceive people with such cheap tricks. He said that people would try to find out if it was possible to go to the outside world, and it was only a matter of time. He said that sooner or later they would be given the right to freely leave this place, and besides, the medicine was no longer needed. A moment later, the Lord turned around as someone was calling him insistently. The man fell to his knees in a hurry and told the Lord that the Risdells had left the estate after meeting with the head maid. He said that they also found out that the last remaining bottle of amnesiac had disappeared from the warehouse. The master froze in shock, as he didn't expect to hear something like that. Jerome looked at the man in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The man looked at the gentleman and said that was not all. A moment later, he said that the young lady had left the outbuilding early in the morning. He looked at the gentleman intently and said that the young lady was currently on the north coast. Kai was shocked by this news. He froze in place. The man said that this meant that they were going to use the preparation on the young lady. The young lord, in a hurry, threw down his umbrella and ran to the carriage. The manager shouted to the gentleman that it was very dangerous to travel alone. He asked the gentleman for permission to accompany him. The young master looked intently at the manager. Jerome, in turn, understood that the young master could not be convinced. A moment later, he mounted his horse in haste and galloped towards the young lady. Kai was furious. He couldn't understand how the young lady could do this to him. Mikhail stood at a distance listening to everything. He was puzzled and did not know what was happening. A moment later, looking around the corner, he saw a terrible picture. The men were in shock. They shouted that they had already used a tranquilizer, but they did not understand why everything was happening like this. The man shouted that he needed to bring more chains and shackle him. The man screamed that he needed to be stopped, grabbed and strangled. Meanwhile, the young man slowly walked into the dungeon. She screamed and begged for mercy, but the monster was advancing on him. A moment later, the basement was filled with blood and screams. The young man was in shock. He slowly covered his mouth with his hand so that the monster could not hear how nervously he was breathing. He heard footsteps approaching him and saw that the monster was approaching him. The young man froze in shock as he turned around and saw a truly terrifying sight. He was very nervous when the monster passed by him, but still he was very lucky because the monster passed by him and did not touch the young man. Mikhail breathed a sigh of relief as he realized that he had managed to escape certain death after all. He was puzzled because he had no idea that it would look like this. He knew that he needed to follow him. He wondered where he was going. He knew that if the monster went into the forest and turned towards the cliff, it could hit the young lady. She looked at her mother intently and said that they should go to the mainland and start a new life there. She said that if they couldn't get used to it, they could always go back to the island. Madame looked at her daughter closely and said that it was not as easy as she thought. Madame said that the capital was probably full of capable maids and workers. She was sent, looked at her daughter, and asked what they would do there. The young lady was taken aback for a moment and thought Madame told her daughter to understand her, as she wanted their family to stay here. She said that she wanted to continue living a peaceful and happy life on the island. The young lady looked at her mother closely and said that she wanted that too. A moment later, her father brought her dinner, but the smell made the young lady feel a little sick. Madame rushed to her daughter as she saw that she was not feeling well. Sir looked at his daughter with surprise and confusion and asked if she was okay. The young lady looked at her father with a puzzled expression and said, "She said she was just feeling sick and not to worry. She said she would feel better if she just lay down for a while." Madame looked at her daughter in surprise and bewilderment because she understood why she was feeling bad, but she said nothing. She looked at her parents and said that the Lord might come looking for her soon since she had come home without telling him anything. She sighed heavily and said that if she saw him, she must make her intentions clear. The young lady looked at her parents intently and asked if they could think about her proposal. She said they could start a new life together outside the island. The madam looked at her daughter closely and with a soft smile said that they would discuss it with her father. The young lady was very happy. She asked if it was true. The madam said that they would certainly discuss everything and also asked her daughter why she didn't take a rest now. The sir looked at his daughter intently and said with a smile that he had brought her some medicine and she should take it before going to bed. He looked at her intently and said that she should drink it right away. The young lady froze, looking at the medicine. He said that she should drink it even if she found it bitter. The young lady in turn agreed with her father and began to drink the medicine. But a moment later, a bullet flew past Madame and everyone froze in shock. Madame, with the speed of lightning, rose from the sofa and puzzled looked into the distance. She did not understand what had just happened. Meanwhile, the young lady, out of fear, dropped the glass with the medicine on the ground, and it broke. For some time there was absolute noise and hell in the house. The young lady, surprised and puzzled, looked into the distance and saw a young lord near the broken window. She was very scared as his face frightened her. The man ran to his daughter with the speed of lightning and told her to get up immediately. He shouted at her that they had to leave the house immediately. He shouted that there was an escape route near the cliff. The young lady was in shock. She screamed at her father to stop, but he screamed at her to run faster. The young lord looked at the young lady with fury. He couldn't believe that she just decided to run away from him.